The Symbiotes, one of the most iconic alien species in Marvel, if not the superhero comic space as a whole. Most of us are generally familiar with how these things work. They are weird blobs of alien goo that bond with people and give them a bunch of superpowers, but also, have a tendency to take over their hosts and sometimes eat people's brains. But is that really all they are? Are the symbiotes merely normal aliens, or is there a deeper level of arcane complexity to their lore? The second one. I'm gonna go ahead and answer my own question. It is the second one. My God, are they complex now? In the last 10 years especially, Marvel has evolved an insane amount on the lore of Venom and his species, adding concepts like Knull, the god of symbiotes, as well as a bunch of time travel and human symbiote hybrids and many other things that are admittedly a little hard to keep track of at times. If you have been wanting a catch-up video on the symbiotes and how they work in general, this is the video for you. Are we going to be covering literally everything about the symbiotes? God no, because that's like 45 years and I only have a couple of hours to do this. But I will give you the things that you need to know so that you'll have a rough understanding of how they work for the canon going forward, which is still going to be quite a lot. But hey, you people on this channel have proven that you are more than willing to stick around for long videos, so let's do it. Now, before we get into the very large amount of lore we're going to be covering, I have to address the order in which I'm going to present it, because when it comes to the symbiotes, I had two options. Option one was to present this kind of like an in-universe history book, start way back in the past at the origin of symbiotes as a species, and move forward from there to the present day. Option 2 was to do this by real publication history, meaning we would begin at the Black Suit Spider-Man arc in the 1980s and go over the lore as it was revealed to the readers. Both of these orders had pros and cons to them, and I felt pretty confident that I could present the video with either structure, meaning I was kind of torn on which to do, and ultimately decided to just do the lazy option. Sorry, I decided to do community engagement with you guys, and so I put it up to a YouTube poll. Over 7,000 people voted 63% in favor of the in-universe timeline, so that's what we're going to be going with. Don't worry, I will make interesting notes about publication as we get to them, and if you're mad about how this turned out, I don't know, argue with democracy. Though there is one kind of interesting quirk about doing the history of the symbiotes by in-universe chronology, which is that we are actually not going to start with symbiotes at all, so that's how you know we're in for some good comic book nonsense today. Our story begins at the beginning of existence itself, like damn near the first point in any Marvel timeline, which is probably a lot farther back than many of you thought we were going to go, but you're just gonna have to trust me to stick to what's relevant to symbiotes. If you do want more details about this, I did another 2-hour video essay about it a couple months ago, which will have all the details of the early period. Also, I do know that plugging a 2-hour video essay in a 2-hour video essay is kind of insane, but if you're the type of person who got excited about this video, you're probably the type of person to be excited that there's another waiting for you. Anyway, back in the first days of reality, there existed the Celestials. Yes, like the Celestials that you are probably thinking of. They were extremely powerful and spent most of their time just experimenting on existence, which at the time was very simple, but the Celestials were working on developing it. This worked out fine for a time, but eventually the Celestials began disagreeing with each other on how exactly to conduct themselves. So they split into two factions, these two factions fought, and their fight became so big that the universe exploded. This is not an exaggeration at all, and it's also not particularly uncommon in Marvel Comics. The Marvel multiverse has been destroyed and restructured several times, and that cycle is key to the lore of the symbiotes of all things. We're going to be hitting this very quickly, but again, just trust me to give you stuff that's relevant to the topic today. So reality, or rather the first version of reality, explodes, and the Celestials who did survive it pop out in the second reality. At this point, they decide, maybe we should set up a checks and balances system just to ensure that that doesn't happen again. The system they designed was another type of being, infinite entities known as the Omegas. The Omegas had two purposes. One, kill their masters if another celestial war were to ever begin, but secondly, the more important one for our topic today, preserve the existence of the multiverse from within. See, the Celestials could learn something from Peter Parker because while they are incredibly powerful, they are also notoriously irresponsible. They don't want to deal with the ramifications of the things that they do, they just want to keep doing their weird creation and strange experiments. The Omegas were supposed to make sure that none of that stuff went too off the rails. With this dynamic established, everything is once again fine for a while. The Celestials keep making weird things, and the Omegas make sure that everything is stable. That is, until one of the Celestials comes up with this newfangled concept called death. Introducing death itself to an existence that previously had no such concept whatsoever understandably caused some problems, and as a result of one of those problems, reality exploded again. A new one arose from its ashes, of course, but at this point, the Celestials are 2 for 2 on breaking everything. Fortunately, once more, the Celestials, and in this case, more importantly, the Omegas, do survive the destruction. The Celestials keep on doing their thing, but the Omegas get sent outside of the multiverse. They don't exist in the third one per se, they exist in like a little bubble, essentially the remnants of the second reality that exists. I mean, this is weird time-space cosmological nonsense. There's not really geographical coordinates to it, they just exist beyond. Me choosing that word was not arbitrary in the slightest, as from this point going forward, the Omegas would be known as the Beyonders. Now, I wanted to point out that name specifically so that very dedicated Marvel fans would know who we're talking about, but for most of this video, I will not be calling them the Beyonders. This group has a billion different names, and the one that is most relevant to the Symbiotes is the Kings in White. The Kings in White, or the Ivory Kings, yes, I did just introduce a new name for them in 3 consecutive lines, don't blame me for that, blame Marvel, continued their work of preserving the multiverse, but now they were doing so from a very different position. The Kings in White existed beyond. They were not located in the multiverse anymore, and this gave them a lot more oversight as to keeping everything in check. They had a very literal outside perspective. They could look into the multiverse from wherever they existed and make sure that everything was functioning properly. But with the advantages of this position came some limitations. These beings were incredibly powerful, and from beyond, they could make sweeping changes to the multiverse with relative ease. They were great at big picture protection, but they were not as good at the small scale stuff. If something demanded a finer touch or a quick response, the Kings in White couldn't exactly do that. Thus, they proposed adding a third party to their cosmic system. The Celestials would continue acting as unbiased forces of creation, development, and expansion. The Kings in White would maintain the multiverse from the outside, and this new role would maintain the multiverse from within. Since the new edition would serve a somewhat opposite role to the Kings in White, it was dubbed the King in Black. Now, king, as opposed to kings, plural, is very important there. The Kings in White are a singular organization. There are rogue Beyonders, of course, but most of them operate outside of the multiverse from one location. The King in Black, however, is singular. There is only one King in Black, at least one per universe. The concept of how they work on a multiversal scale is very weird, and we're going to come back to that, but not until way later in this video. So for now, just know that there is one King in Black, not a bunch of them. The final thing we need to establish before we can start talking about specific characters is the tools that the Cosmic Kings use to complete their work. The power used by the King in White is a force that has a bunch of names, but for dramatic purposes that will pay off later, I'm going to refer to it here as the Unipower. The Unipower has a lot more lore, which again, later, but for now, just know that it is usually represented by light. Then, as you can probably guess, the King in Black uses a parallel power known as Living Abyss. Living Abyss is represented by darkness, but specifically in the context of like primordial nothingness, the void between realities, and this void is where we finally meet Knull. We're going to time skip forward very substantially now. Where we last picked up on the story, we were in the 3rd iteration of reality. Now we are going to zoom all the way to the 7th, or more accurately, kind of the gap space between the 6th and the 7th. Here we see, well, nothing really. There is no reality yet. This is the gap between universes. There is nothing here but a primordial void, and one singular entity. This entity is Knull. Now you might be wondering how Knull exists when literally nothing else does, and the answer to that is pretty simple. He is a god. He doesn't have to follow the standard rules of logic. As a cosmic embodiment of sorts, he comes into being when the thing that he embodies does. And Knull is a god of darkness, which means this primordial void is his pinnacle of power. He's not really evil at this stage yet, because there's kind of nothing to be evil against. Knull is completely content to just drift endlessly in this sea of nothingness, but the Celestials are about to ruin his night. In the middle of our little time skip, the Celestials have just kind of been doing the same stuff. They do their weird creation, weird experiments, eventually something causes reality to blow up, oopsie doopsie, but they're fine, they just go on to the next one. Eventually, it comes time for the Celestials to break their way into Reality 7, and they do so quite explosively, bringing with them a burst of energy and light into Knull's eternal void, which he is not happy about. However, in classic irresponsible Celestial fashion, these cosmic masterminds don't really care that Knull is pissed at them. In fact, they might not even notice. See, one of the first things that has to happen when the Celestials enter a new reality is that they appoint a new King in Black. And Knull, I mean, he's clearly already versed in Living Abyss since he's a god of darkness, and he's, there, so they just kind of throw the role at him. Now, many other cosmic entities might simply accept the role, right? After all, King in Black is a pretty good job to get. You get a gigantic power boost from the Living Abyss, and also you get to have a tremendous amount of influence over the preservation of your reality, since you are one of the 3 primordial forces keeping it going. But Knull is very spiteful, and the Celestials just said let there be light and ruined his nap. So he accepts the job, receives the Living Abyss boost, and then immediately turns on them. Now, 10 to 15 minutes into this video, I haven't recorded the intro yet, so I don't know exactly what timestamp we're at, we finally get to the first symbiote, and one of the most metal moments in everything we're going to be discussing today. At this point, the only things in all of existence are the Celestials, the light that they are emitting, and Knull. This means that Knull is the only thing casting a shadow. And with the power of his unbridled rage and the Living Abyss, he forges his own shadow, the first shadow in all existence, into a blade, and with one strike of that blade, decapitates a Celestial. This is amazing, and it's one hell of a start to Knull's reign of terror, but unfortunately for the God of Darkness, there's a lot more than one Celestial there, and even though he is strong enough to kill one of them, he is nowhere near powerful enough to defeat all of the others at once, and so they cast him out into the void of space. Importantly, they don't kill him because he is the King in Black now, but they do just sort of throw him far enough away that he won't be a problem for a while. With Knull's darkness colonized, basically, the Celestials begin their work and start developing the universe. But Knull, at the far fringes of space, is not content to just sit there. He wants to cast these invaders out. He is going to fight their light away and reclaim his infinite darkness, and he now has a weapon to do that. Now, just a second ago, I said that we finally reached the first symbiote of the story, and let me be very clear on who I mean by that. Knull is not actually a symbiote. This is a common misconception, but he is a god and creator of the symbiotes. Think of their dynamic kind of like a necromancer and their army of skeletons. They might share some characteristics, but they are not the same thing. The symbiote, then, is Knull's weapon. This is All Black the Necro Sword, and it is one of the most feared blades in the entire universe. Though I should probably note that All Black is not a symbiote in the traditional sense. We'll get to the creation of those shortly, but in these early comics, they do refer to All Black as a proto-symbiote, so it's like the earliest generations of them and something that Knull would experiment on going forward. After slaying that Celestial with All Black, Knull sought out the cosmic being's decapitated head, and using the energies found in that skull as a forge, began to refine his blade even further. This is where Knull starts to get creative with the Living Abyss at his disposal. When I say that he uses the Celestial head as a forge, that's not a metaphor. With the cosmic heat found there, he takes the tools of a blacksmith and quite literally forges darkness itself into the shapes that he needs it. First, he improves All Black, increasing its power and giving it sentience. Yes, the sword is an independent entity. From there, he makes armor and then decides to get bigger, creating an entire planet-like structure purely out of darkness to serve as his base of operations. He would then leave the head for his new planet, but if you're wondering what happened to the giant Celestial head floating in space, well, a lot of you have probably seen a giant Celestial head floating in space before, especially in Guardians of the Galaxy media. That's right, this decapitated head is what would later become Nowhere. Knull did not specifically have a hand in it becoming Nowhere, I mean, other than the hand that cut the head off, I guess, but he had expended all of the cosmic light before it became a space station and did not attend to it from there. He had other things to do. His goal in all this is nothing more than a spite-filled crusade. Knull wants to kill all the Celestials and purge every last drop of light and life from reality, returning existence to his void, and this is the only thing that motivates him. The problem is that Knull is one singular being. Even though he is a very powerful one, the Celestials have already proven that collectively they can defeat him with ease. So if he wants to have any shot, Knull is going to need an army, and so he turns to the Living Abyss once more. Knull has been able to make living creatures out of the abyss before. That's what he did with All Black, and as he develops on that idea, he starts making monsters. Relatively simple at first, shadow creatures and gigantic terrifying beasts, but as he experiments more, his creations become more complex. A turning point in this is a conflict Knull has with a time-traveling Silver Surfer. Yes, like Norrin Radd's Silver Surfer, but way back in the past during Knull's first era of conquest. Knull is able to defeat the Surfer, but instead of just killing him outright, chooses to instead infect him with Living Abyss, corrupting him into the being known as the Void Knight. Void Knight serves Knull's army for a while, but is later freed, at which point, this isn't super relevant to the video, but it's cool enough that I want to include it, Silver Surfer beats Knull in their second fight by expending almost all of his power at once to create an entire sun right in front of Knull's face, and that burst of light is enough to bring the god down. Amazingly, Knull recovers from this defeat, which is why the exact way Silver Surfer brought him down isn't the most important part to the story, but the Void Knight thing is very key because this is the first example of Knull using the Abyss as a corrupting force. But before we talk about him really capitalizing on that, there is one more of his defeats that we need to mention, the one that results in him losing his sword. We don't need to go into huge detail here, but at some point in the past, Knull fought an entire army of things that are only described as golden armored gods, and while he defeated most of them, one of the last survivors managed to impale Knull on his spear. This also did not kill Knull, but it incapacitated him long enough that his sword was recovered by someone else. This someone else was Gorr the God Butcher, who wielded All Black in his own little spite crusade to kill every god in the universe. Interestingly, after Knull's recovery, he was actually aware that Gorr had his own sword, but chose not to recover it because he simply kind of approved of how the alien was using it. I mean, killing all the gods was something that Knull was going to have to do on his own eventually, and so if somebody else was doing that work for him, that just meant that he could multitask. This idea of multitasking was the final piece of the puzzle. Knull's conquest was going well, but it could be going faster, and at this point he knew that he could corrupt beings with the Living Abyss, and he knew that if other beings were doing his work for him, then that would just speed along his goals. So he began work on a construct that could corrupt things, and also go on to have those things spread corruption further. Now, finally, we are at the real symbiotes. The symbiotes were by far Knull's most devious creation. He had other scarier looking monsters in his army, and by comparison, the symbiotes were just little blobs of darkness, but their ability was that corruption. The symbiotes bonded to hosts, dominating their bodies and their minds and enslaving their will to Knull's darkness. From there, they could replicate and spread, meaning that every individual symbiote was a little seed that would grow and grow and grow, easily spreading the abyss to every part of the universe that the species touched. Now, there's going to be a whole section on symbiote biology once we're done with this little history of Knull part, so don't worry, I will expand on that in more detail. But for now, the most important part of the biology that you need to know is that these symbiotes were also part of a hive mind. All of Knull's monsters were technically in this hive mind, but the symbiotes were the most relevant to it. With only a few symbiotes and enough time, Knull could take over entire planets, and he could do so relatively independently, using the hive mind to check in on them only when needed. This tactic worked wonders, and the symbiotes quickly began spreading Knull's darkness across the entire galaxy. But their connection, both to each other and to their hosts, once their greatest strength, also proved to be their greatest weakness. This is the part of the story where Earth finally enters the picture, as a few of Knull's creations would make their way there in the distant past. These were no normal symbiotes, though. They were some of Knull's stronger warriors, commonly referred to simply as symbiote dragons. Symbiote dragons were bigger, stronger, and did not require a host to bond with, but they were just as capable of spreading darkness, in fact, even better at it. You know how most dragons breathe out fire or some other kind of energy, maybe acid or something like that? Symbiote dragons breathe symbiotes. So obviously, when two of these monstrosities made their way to Earth, the planet's defenders had a response. But again, this was way in the distant past. There was no Spider-Man, no X-Men, no Avengers, but there was still Thor. A young Thor, Odin's son, defeated the invading dragons, unintentionally inspiring the myth of Beowulf in the process. Yeah, this is the canon background for Beowulf in the Marvel Universe. The dragons are Grendel and its mother. As impressive as this was, Thor's defeat of the dragons was not a total victory, as the dragons are kind of like tiny symbiote hives in and of themselves. While the dragons, in quotes, were defeated, little pieces of them split off and scattered themselves across Earth. These were more like normal symbiotes, and so they sought out hosts. This might sound like a total failure at first. After all, Knull sent the dragons there to invade the planet, and now the planet has been successfully invaded. But there's one very key thing about the dragons' defeat, and that is that they were destabilized. When a symbiote dragon invades a planet, it's supposed to swoop down, spray symbiotes over the population, corrupt them, and then leave, defeating any defenders in the process. It is not supposed to get blasted open by a thunder god, with its constituent parts being scattered over the planet instead. This meant that the symbiotes on Earth were partially disconnected from the hive mind. Injured and unable to communicate with their master, the symbiotes were only seeking out hosts so that they would have time to grow and recover. But with Knull's control over them no longer complete, the bond that they have with their hosts began to go two ways. These early symbiotes began to assimilate ideals and behavior from their human hosts. This included thoughts of nobility and preservation and life, which did not at all align with Knull's goals of destruction and eternal darkness. The symbiote hive mind had, in a sense, become infected with humanity, and as more symbiotes began to develop this, the infection spread to larger and larger chunks of that system. As more symbiotes developed the ability to think for themselves for the first time, they started to question their master, doubting his ideals of single-minded tyranny and destruction of everything that did not fit his mold. Eventually, the mass of rebel symbiotes became such a statistically significant portion of the hive mind that they turned on Knull entirely. With the best part of his army turned on him, Knull's conquest slowed to a halt, and the symbiotes began to make their way back to their master's base so that they could defeat him. Now, the symbiotes, vast in number though they were still not strong enough to kill Knull outright. Their creator outmatched them by a very wide margin, but they could imprison him. If you recall, Knull's main headquarters was a planet of his own creation. It was one that he had built out of Living Abyss, and as the symbiotes flocked back to the place of their creation, they were able to trap Knull within it, forcing him to the planet's core and using their own bodies in the millions, if not billions, to keep him there. Thus, Knull's remaining influence over the hive mind was locked away, as he was simply too deep to reach his consciousness out and control any of his minions. Finally freed from Knull's tyranny, the symbiotes vowed to keep watch over Knull's eternal prison, and began thinking of the place as their homeworld, giving it the name Clintar. Yeah, that's what Clintar is. It is a planet literally made of symbiotes, designed as a cage to imprison a primordial god. This was still a long time in Marvel's past, and so over the centuries, it has become a little bit more planet-like as it has been terraformed, but the core of it, that is still just all symbiote matter. From this point on, many of the symbiotes decided that they wanted to atone for their master's actions against the universe, and actually became a force for good, forming an organization called the Agents of the Cosmos. Now, the Agents of the Cosmos are not super important. They do have one really big important role that we'll get to in just a couple of minutes, but I bring them up now as an example of the fact that symbiotes really do have free will at this point. There are plenty of good symbiotes out there who just want to protect the universe, and most of the symbiotes based on Clintar are of this group, at least for a while. But like any species, there are also bad ones, symbiotes who want to corrupt and conquer and spread their influence. This is why we see a lot of evil symbiotes. They are a species now. They are not truly good, not truly evil. They have their own thoughts and opinions. This is a great segue to talking about symbiote biology. We've gone over their early history, we'll return to their history when we get more into the modern era, but right now, let's take a pause and talk about how exactly they work. Two things we need to establish at the beginning of this part just so that we have them going forward. One, I personally know the difference between symbiotic and parasitic relationships, like in real-world biology. I understand the line between those, but Marvel uses that line like a jump rope when it comes to how symbiote and host relationships are described. So biology nerds in the audience, it's not my fault, you're just gonna have to deal with it. Secondly, symbiotes are not truly organic, at least not in the most strict sense of the word. Originally, they are born as magical beings made out of literal darkness given life. However, since they can assimilate things, which is a large part of what this biology section is going to be about, they have assimilated biological characteristics to some degree. So I would just call them pseudo-biological, and that's going to be good enough. Now, with that established, as you can probably already tell, symbiote biology is very weird and often inconsistent, so I will describe this as best as I can for you, and we will start off at the most basic level. The default form of a symbiote is a weird little blob. These blobs can be in a variety of colors and patterns. Somewhat surprisingly, the color of a symbiote doesn't really have any effect on it beyond appearance. Yes, I know there's that line in Venom 2 where Venom is scared of Carnage because he's a red one. That is not a thing from the comics. Carnage is red because he happened to bond with his first host through blood, and that just led to him being blood colored, but it does not mean that he is stronger. Symbiotes can survive without a host, but only temporarily. The exact time that one can exist alone does kind of vary from case to case, but eventually all symbiotes will start to degenerate if they don't have a bond for long enough. This is probably a feature that Knull kind of baked into their creation as a way to incentivize them being active in their conquering. However, even in their weakened state, they can still shapeshift. Symbiotes without a host can take on a variety of different forms, usually small animals. Like in these cases, there's not actually a dog or a cat under there, it is just a symbiote without a host taking on a different form to blend in. In very limited cases, they can take on bigger shapes without anything inside. Some symbiotes can become humanoid on their own, but as a general rule, the bigger the shape, the less time they can hold it for. Inside their blob forms, symbiotes do have something resembling genetics. This is kind of ill-defined because, again, they are pseudo-biological, but I feel pretty safe saying that symbiotes do have cells and DNA, or at the very least, structures that are extremely functionally similar to cells and DNA. They also do have genetic memory to some capacity. We will go over how symbiotes reproduce at the end of this biology section, but they can access memories from their ancestors to some degree. Now, when symbiotes bond to a host, this is, of course, where things get a lot more interesting. Symbiotes appear to be able to bond with almost any organic thing, even if that host is unwilling, though how long a resistant bond will last depends heavily on the willpower of both parties involved. When a symbiote is bonded with a host, that host acts as a stable anchor being, let's call it, which gives the symbiote license to use its abilities to the full extent. Primarily, they get way more developed shape-shifting. Their default state in a bond is as kind of a second skin over the host's body, but most symbiotes can also choose to retract their matter inside the host to be more incognito. They can also often do this partially, changing the color and texture of their external forms to look like clothing. Yes, in a lot of Venom comics, Eddie Brock is technically not wearing clothes, that is just a shape-shifted Venom only covering part of him. They also, of course, use this ability offensively, extending parts of their body outwards and shaping it into various forms of weapon. All symbiotes can make pretty much all forms of weapon. It's not like one of them can only make blades and one of them can only make whips, etc., but just like people, they have their preferences and different tools that they are better or more experienced with. Some symbiotes also develop chemical abilities, though the reason that only some of them can do this has never been explained. This pink one, Agony, has acid spit, and this one, Sleeper, can synthesize any chemical compound within his body, which is an incredibly overpowered ability, but whatever. In addition to gaining freedom of their own abilities while bonded to a host, symbiotes also have complete control over their host's biological systems. This does include their minds, though again, hosts with a strong enough willpower can fight this off. But the key thing underpinning all of this is symbiote-host compatibility. While symbiotes can bond with anybody, a complex cocktail of biological specifics means that not every host is going to be a good match for every symbiote. The more compatible a symbiote and host are, the longer the bond can stay together, and also, I'll just put this bluntly I guess, the more the symbiote can screw with the host's biological construction. Easy example of this is Venom and Carnage. Venom usually keeps himself in a relatively humanoid body plan. Even his own much larger head just goes around Eddie's head. There are cases when Venom is able to contort himself into a weird form, and yeah, this absolutely will break Eddie's bones, but then because Venom has total access to Eddie's biology, he can sort of provide him a healing factor and knit him back together. But then there's Carnage and his host Cletus Cassidy. Carnage and Cletus have a 100% perfect symbiote host compatibility. This is a very, very rare thing, and it's one of the factors that makes Carnage so terrifying. Carnage's shapeshifting is completely unbound by the fact that there's a dude in there, meaning he can do things like rip his entire torso open if he wants. Venom can't do that. He might be able to break some bones, but he can't tear Eddie 100% in half and then put them together again. But Carnage and Cletus, this pair is so fundamentally matched that they are treated essentially as one being, meaning that when Carnage goes back together, Cletus inside does too. This is a sidebar, but one that I have to go on. This is one of the reasons that Venom Let There Be Carnage kind of pisses me off, because the entire conflict of that movie, it's spoilers, but it's years old at this point, revolves around the fact that Carnage and Cletus are incompatible, which is the complete opposite of what they are in the comics, and yet they still show Carnage doing things that only work in the lore because of the perfect bond. So they try to have it both ways, and that's not how it works, and it bugs me. Notably, this biological control is not always used for good or helpful things. While symbiotes usually use this to heal their host of injuries or diseases, it can be used in the opposite direction. Venom once gave Eddie cancer as a way to ensure that the human could not abandon their bond, which is insane. I mean, symbiote and host relationships are toxic a lot of the time in multiple senses of the word. Speaking of symbiotes and things that are toxic to them, let's talk about their weaknesses. Not my best transition, but I'll work with it. I think most people are at least somewhat aware of the things that hurt Venom and his kind most, that being fire and sound. Originally, these were just features of symbiote biology, with the logic being that these were factors that could destabilize a symbiote bond. Heat would speed up the molecules, and sound waves would cause them to vibrate. This has since been expanded upon, though, in a way that we actually already talked about. Remember how Knull forged the symbiotes? Like, he literally made their kind originally with celestial heat and a hammer? That is now the canon cause for symbiote weaknesses. The entire species has a baseline foundational reaction built into them to the circumstances of their own creation. The heat of the forge and the sound of the hammer cause them distress. This is cool, but is also kind of controversial among the fan base, which I do completely understand. If you want symbiotes to be more scientific, then the molecular destabilization explanation makes a lot more sense than some weird esoteric arcane fear of ancient circumstances. But regardless, you can kind of just take both of them as canon. It's not that big of a deal. Also, as a final note in this section, symbiotes do absolutely eat people. Their food is found in human brains. It has been said before that symbiotes feed on negative emotion, which is kind of weird and doesn't really match the rest of their vibe. This was expanded upon later to not technically be wrong, but more specifically be that the symbiotes feed on the chemicals that the brain creates when experiencing negative emotions. For one, they can feed on a thing called phenethylamine, which is a neurotransmitter, but more importantly for the emotional part, they can also feed on adrenaline. This is why symbiotes are such violent and scary predators. They actively need their prey to be afraid in order to get a lot of nutritional value from it. They don't necessarily have to take this stuff from their prey, though. They can also feed on neurotransmitters and biomass from their own hosts, though this will, kill them, which means that a symbiote feeding on its host usually isn't going to last that long and will have to jump from host to host in order to continue existing. Now, everything I've said up to this point has been the baseline of symbiote biology, the things that more or less apply to every member of the species. However, symbiotes differ from each other quite a bit because, as was mentioned in their history, the assimilation bond goes both ways. When a symbiote and a host are bonded for a longer period of time, the symbiote will start adopting characteristics of that host. This can be personality traits, it can be things like skills or talents, and it can even be powers and abilities if they are genetic based. If the bond lasts for long enough, or the host has a feature that is notably unique, then that adapted trait can become a permanent feature of the symbiote going forward. This is why Venom web swings. He learned the technique and rough chemical composition of the web fluid from Peter Parker. And speaking of Peter Parker, we need to address the spider. Why on earth does Venom have a big spider or spider-like symbol on his chest even when he is not bonded to Peter Parker? Like, sure, originally it could just be a feature of the costume, but this is like an iconic Venom thing, and his origin has nothing to do with spiders. The answer's kind of dumb, I'm not gonna lie. The reason why Venom had it originally is that it's not supposed to be a spider, it is technically, within the lore, a dragon. Because remember how Knull had symbiote dragons and he really liked dragons, and apparently dragons were just such a big part of his iconography? Yeah, the symbol was a dragon. If all that sounds like a kind of lazy retcon and a very shaky reason to give Knull the spider-like symbol and therefore make him more visually connected to Venom, yeah, it is nothing more than that. So yeah, it's a dragon, and then when Spider-Man got it, it just got like adapted into looking more like a spider. Venom's kids don't have it because it's not a genetic factor, but like Knull has it, and then he put it into some of his creations, which got passed down. So it is sort of a genetic factor. I don't know, it's dumb, but this is what we have. Though that does provide a good transition into talking about symbiote reproduction. Symbiotes reproduce asexually, they have no concept of sex or gender within their own species, and when it looks like they do, it's just because they're mimicking their host. They generate these things referred to as symbiote seeds within their bodies, and then as those seeds grow and develop, they will simply split off from the host and grow into a new symbiote. But they do this for very specific reasons. One of the cool parts of symbiote genetic lore, in stark contrast to the whole dragon thing, is that symbiotes don't reproduce randomly or on any sort of set cycle. Rather, symbiotes as a collective have that hive mind connection, which gives them a slightly precognitive sense of danger. This does not mean that they can tell you what exactly the danger is, but it does mean that they start the reproductive cycle automatically when their mild psychic connection senses danger to the species as a whole. This means that when new symbiotes start being born, you can take it as an early warning sign of some sort of large-scale crisis on the horizon. I love this. I think it's a very cool bit of world building. It both feels believable as a weird symbiotic alien hive mind feature, and also, narratively, it functions as a nice parallel to Spider Sense. So yes, I do think that makes up for the dragon. At least mostly. Now we're almost done with the biology section of the video, meaning we will get back to the history, but there are two things that I want to cover really quick, and I don't really know where else to slot them in, so I'm just going to shove them in here. First off, we have seen people use symbiote-based biotech before. This has happened a lot, but the best example of it is the superior Iron Man armor, which flows on and off of Tony's body just like a symbiote does. Not really too much more to say about this, because the canon status of this suit is very dubious at best thanks to Secret Wars, but still, it's a very cool thing to mention. The more important thing I'm going to stick in here at the end is a different type of symbiote, or more accurately, a separate type of being that runs parallel to them, the anti-symbiotes. Some of you have definitely heard of anti-venom and are wondering where exactly that fits into the symbiote lore as a whole, and somewhat surprisingly, they actually don't really fit in. Anti-symbiotes are a similar but separate thing. Anti-Venom was the first of the anti-symbiotes, and he was created when pieces of the Venom symbiote were exposed to the power of Mr. Negative. Yes, very similar to what happens in Spider-Man 2, the video game. They actually got it shockingly right. The reasoning behind it was a little bit different though. In the comics, Anti-Venom was made because it was right after Venom gave Eddie cancer, and Eddie did not want to live with cancer Venom, so he split off from the symbiote anyway, and then sought out a cure for his cancer, which ended up being Mr. Negative. Mr. Negative healed him with his power, and because Eddie still had some residual symbiote bits in his system, those grew into Anti-Venom. Anti-Venom is not a symbiote. It is symbiote-like, but there are a lot of very key differences. It is not part of the hive mind, and it doesn't even have its own consciousness. Anti-Venom is not going to speak to its host. It also has healing abilities because the symbiote matter was specifically bonded to Eddie's white blood cells, and so Anti-Venom is like a weird white blood cell symbiote hybrid. While this means it can heal people, it is also extremely toxic to true symbiotes. The touch of Anti-Venom alone is enough to burn symbiote matter instantly. This ability, plus its lack of sentience, meaning that it is much safer than a normal symbiote, makes Anti-Venom a very good counter to regular symbiotes, and therefore it got experimented on quite a bit. While Anti-Venom was originally singular and directly connected to Mr. Negative, the process of creating an anti-symbiote from symbiote matter has since been replicated, and so there are other ones running around. The easiest way to tell whether a symbiote is normal or anti is whether their primary color is white, except in this case, where this one is not an anti-symbiote and it just looks like that. So you kind of just have to guess. And now that everyone has an idea more or less of how the symbiotes work, it's time to get back to the history. Where we left this off, Knull had been defeated and imprisoned in Clintar, with the symbiote species going out, spreading across the galaxy, and being aliens of all various moralities. Now we're going to zoom in a little bit and talk about the history of symbiotes, specifically as it relates to Earth. Now, a lot of this is going to have to do with Venom, but we're not going to start there because, well, remember how Thor beat up a couple of dragons a while ago? Of course, that had consequences. We don't know what happened to every symbiote that split off from the original dragons, and in fact, a lot of them probably died, given that they were injured and cut off from Knull's control for the first time, but enough of them survived to begin symbiote cults. This might seem like a minor continuity error at first. After all, wasn't being severed from the hive mind the thing that let symbiotes be free of Knull and independent? Yes, that is true, but remember, it wasn't an immediate process. All the split did was allow the symbiotes to be influenced by their hosts, so they did not turn good immediately, and several of them tried to reconnect with their god. And yeah, magical slime aliens whispering about a primordial god of darkness into the ear of 5th century humans is absolutely the kind of thing that would make a very successful cult, one that did last until the modern day. Two things we need to address about these cults. Well, one that we need to for the lore, and one that's just a fun fact. The fun fact is that while the Cult of Knull predates the Marvel Age of Heroes by a very long time, it does have a direct line to it in the form of one of Cletus Cassidy's ancestors. This is Cortland Cassidy, and he is just as bad as his descendant, but also doesn't matter nearly as much as you might think he does. He's only been in 2 comics ever. Still, fun connection. The more important piece of lore is that this cult gives us a chance to address Knull's most iconic symbol. No, it is not a red dragon, as a certain piece of Venom lore would have you believe. It is instead a red spiral. You may have noticed this in the video already. Symbiotes that instead of the iconic white eyes have this massive spiral covering most of their face. This is a direct indicator of Knull's control. This is why you see it on all of the early symbiotes. This was when they were under their master's control or had just recently broken from it. But now that's not a problem anymore. After all, Knull is trapped in Clintar, his consciousness suppressed by millions if not billions of symbiote consciousnesses in close proximity to him. So seeing the Knull spiral in the present day would be a really, really bad thing. Hopefully that never happens, right? Anyway, the next big symbiote event on Earth is when the Knull spiral shows up again. Yay! This mark on the timeline takes place during the, get ready for a wild tone shift here, the Vietnam War. Not like a fancy sci-fi version of it, no, this is just the real Vietnam War, but in Marvel, which means there was also sci-fi stuff happening a little bit. You might understandably be wondering why the Vietnam War matters for this. I mean, that seems like a very random place to do a symbiote story, and it is. Except, this arc happens because of a pun. I kid you not, this storyline is referred to as Venom. So back in Nam, the US military was looking for any edge that they could use to win the conflict, and found a wild one thanks to some investigation by S.H.I.E.L.D. Once again, call back to Thor fighting the dragons. Yeah, turns out he did not kill one of them, and merely incapacitated it enough that it was frozen in ice. As they always seem to do when confronted with anything even remotely super-y, the military decided to try this as a form of super soldier augmentation. Enter the Sim Soldier program. Not entirely understanding what this dragon was, S.H.I.E.L.D. extracted samples from it, which were of course symbiotes, and bonded them to several men, creating effective super soldiers, at least for a while. See, if these had been normal symbiotes, maybe this would have gone better, and we will see the military try something like this again in future years. But these were not present-day symbiotes, these were symbiotes that had essentially been in stasis for hundreds of years, and had gone into that stasis right after being split from the hive mind. These symbiotes had not been infected with good ideals, they were still loyal to Knull. And remember, these dragons are big, large enough that they can kind of act like a nexus point for the symbiote hive mind. So with one of them free and running around, Knull could not reconnect to it per se, since his connection was more put on hold than actually cut off, but still, he could exert his influence. And it didn't help that the military was ripping pieces out of the dragon to infect people, which hurt very badly, and so with a tortured dragon hive mind nexus, I mean, what you think would happen happened. Most of the Sim soldiers went on a Knull bloodlusted rampage, but were defeated by other S.H.I.E.L.D. operatives and Wolverine, who was also in this project for some reason, at which point the Grendel dragon was contained within a secure location, where I'm sure it will remain secure, because of course the point of this one-shot comic is to establish the containment of a dragon and how safe it is and how that will never matter again. There is technically one other piece of symbiote history related to Earth specifically, that being a very weird little guy named Flexo. A long story short, he's an old comic character where he was a robot made of space rubber or something like that, and in the modern day, writers decided that space rubber might be a symbiote, and so they retconned it and recontextualized his origin into being a lot scarier. I'm not going to go into it here because Flexo is ultimately tangential to the main storyline of the symbiotes. Also, my buddy Comic Drake did a whole 11-minute deep dive on it where you get everything you need to know about Flexo, so once you're done with this video, you can just go and watch that one if you're craving more symbiote stuff. Now, after a shocking 40 minutes where he was barely mentioned, we are finally going to talk about the history of Venom specifically. Though I do need to establish two things before we do that, because this is where things are going to get a little bit weird timeline-wise. First off, I just want to make it very clear what we're going to be covering in this section. This video is intended as a history of the symbiotes, not a history of Venom specifically. And while a lot of it is going to revolve around Venom, we're not going to be covering every single story that this character has been in. I will hit the most important ones, but specifically the ones that relate to symbiote lore as a whole. Otherwise, we will have over 800 comics and counting to cover, and I simply do not have the time. I am going to talk about Venom's origin though, because I assume people are curious, and that's why the timeline is going to get a little bit screwy. Venom is old, probably older than you think, and his story does not begin on Earth. So while I'm presenting most of this in chronological order, if I did it strictly by chronology, then I would have to divert a while ago, talk about Venom out in space, then go back to Earth, do all the Earth stuff, and then return to Venom in the modern day. So we're just going to backtrack, tell the origin of Venom from start to finish, and then get back on track. I hope that makes sense. The symbiote that would become Venom is not actually named Venom. This is a code name that it uses because it's easier for humans to understand, but its true name is in the symbiote language, which as a hive mind species is very difficult for other minds to process. The earliest days of this symbiote are a little bit convoluted, mostly because they've been through a lot of retcons. You could probably tell from everything else in this video so far, but symbiote lore is very complicated now, and a lot of that is because of comics that have come out in the last decade or so. Some comics have stated that Venom was born during the Reign of Knull, which was a very, very long time ago, but others have shown flashbacks to it which take place on Clintar, and that would be a little bit later in the timeline. The Clintar one seems to be the current canon, so that's what I'm going to go with. Regardless, the most important thing about Venom's birth is that he wasn't particularly special. Venom is not a chosen symbiote or a super symbiote or anything like that. He is a regular one just like any other member of the species, and he is described as the 998th in his lineage. Its early days on Clintar seem relatively uneventful, but we do know who the symbiote's first host was. In fact, we know very well because there's an entire miniseries simply called Venom First Host. At some point, the symbiote was picked up by exploring Kree, who decided to use it as a living weapon in the Kree-Skrull War. This is where Venom would make his first bond to a Kree soldier named Tel-Kar. Tel-Kar was ultimately heroic, a little bit insane, but a good soldier nonetheless, using the symbiote's shape-shifting capabilities to infiltrate the Skrull army as he could pass for one of them more easily. This worked for a while, but eventually he was captured, and the symbiote managed to escape. Now isolated, the symbiote ended up on an ice planet, where it was forced to bond with a native alien in order to survive. Unfortunately, this native was extremely violent and brutal, and since Venom had to stick with it for so long, some of those ideals seeped into the symbiote's own consciousness. This is the canon reason why the symbiote is a little bit insane and psychopathic. No, it's not because of Deadpool. That is a common misconception, but it comes from a joke comic called Deadpool's Secret Wars. In fact, I can show you the panel that started the misconception. This comic has a thing where Deadpool very briefly bonds to the symbiote before Spider-Man does for the first time, but he does not last long enough for his insanity to bleed over. There's a panel where he says he hopes that doesn't happen, and that is where people are kind of getting this idea from. But this is not like a joke saying that the symbiote is insane because of Deadpool. It's exactly the opposite. This is Deadpool saying, I don't want this symbiote because I don't want it to be insane, and then ending the bond before any bleed over can happen. Also, yeah, Deadpool looks like this in this comic, which should be another indicator that this one was not particularly serious when it comes to canon. Now there's a little bit of a gap in Venom's history, or to be more specific, there's kind of the exact opposite of a gap. The next part has been described in so many different ways that I have no idea which one of them is technically canon. Regardless, the symbiote is imprisoned. Several different groups have been stated to be the ones who imprison him, and I do not know which is correct, so I'm just not going to bother working it out. The symbiote is imprisoned, that's the part that matters. Then the canon will stay hand-wavy for a minute because somehow Venom's prison canister gets incorporated into the Beyonders battle world back in the first Secret Wars event. I'm really surprised that there's not a better explanation as to why exactly this happened, but if there is one, I could not easily find it. It really seems like he just kind of ended up there when the Beyonder was making his pocket dimension, and that's it. Now we finally reach, by publication timeline, Venom's first appearance in 1984's Secret Wars number 8. In this comic, Peter Parker, while in the Battleworld Pocket Dimension, finds a weird device that contains a small black blob. He then touches it, great idea Spider-Man, touch the weird alien thing you've never seen before, and it turns into what he thinks is an alien costume. I do want to very quickly sidebar here and say that the real-world writing origin of the black suit is a weirdly debated and interesting thing. I'm not going to go into it verbally because it's kind of a tangent that's not lore-related, but I am saying it verbally because I'm going to put it in a big text box on the screen, and you can read it if you like. Anyway, at this point, most of us kind of know how this story goes for the next few chapters. Peter continues to wear the suit, not thinking anything bad of it, and liking the convenience. After all, it can generate its own webbing and also be deployed and retracted at will, so for Spider-Man, who often needs to change costumes and worry about web fluid, this is an ideal situation. The symbiote, for its part of the dynamic, actually likes this relationship quite a bit. It in and of itself is not evil, plus it starts assimilating a lot of Peter's heroic ideals. This thing likes fighting crime, and it wants to do so more often, so it starts puppeting Peter's body around and fighting crime independently. While not an immediate problem at first, to such an extent that Peter himself is not even aware of what's going on, it does start to take a toll. The symbiote most often takes over him when he sleeps, and since his body is then being active almost 24/7, Peter starts to feel exhaustion constantly. This eventually gets to a point where Peter starts to become suspicious. His exhaustion, plus the fact that what he thinks is a costume is acting more and more organic, sets off alarm bells, and he, with the help of the Fantastic Four, starts to investigate it further. With the Four's machines, he realizes for the first time that the costume is in fact alive, and not only that, it likes Peter a lot and wants to bond with him permanently, which Spider-Man wants nothing to do with. With the Four's help, Peter is able to remove the symbiote and contain it, though it would shortly escape and pursue Spider-Man once again, hoping to solidify their bond. This leads to the iconic confrontation in the church that has been adapted into pretty much every form of media. Injured by the sound waves coming from the bell, the symbiote flees into the church's lower levels, and Peter is free. Then, the symbiote goes on a Deadpool adventure very briefly, because, I don't know, man, Deadpool comics really just like ruining the Venom timeline, and I am kind of bitter about it, but at the end of this officially canon Deadpool story, it just returns to the church where the fight happens, so none of this actually matters. And then, who should arrive but one Edward Brock? Eddie Brock was a disgraced reporter whose stories had been debunked by Peter Parker, leading to his career getting absolutely destroyed, and a lot of other things along with it. His father had disowned him, his wife had abandoned him. It was a very bad time to be Eddie Brock. Things had gotten so bad for Eddie that he was considering taking his own life, and arriving at this church was his last attempt at turning things around. He was there to pray, hoping he would find some sort of forgiveness, and something else found him instead. Thus, Venom was born, at this stage a full-on supervillain. The symbiote bond between Eddie and Venom was motivated almost entirely by mutual hatred. They were a good match for each other, as would be explored upon later, but at this point, the symbiote was only interested in Spider-Man and was basically using Eddie as a rebound, something that he could use to take out his vengeance while also trying to get back in bond with Peter again. Then for his next many appearances, Venom is simply a Spider-Man antagonist. This is the classic era of Venom, but we're not going to be talking about it a lot in this video, because at this point, Venom was just a weird alien without a lot of lore, and all of the Clintar stuff would come later. For the next several years, he fought Spider-Man a lot, he joined up with the Sinister Six, he threatened MJ, you know how it goes. The next major storyline for our purposes comes after the symbiote's apparent death. Venom got caught in the crossfire during a battle between Spider-Man and lesser-known villains Styx and Stone, and the powers of Styx apparently killed the symbiote, but it would later be revealed that this was just a forced split between Venom and Eddie, at which point Eddie was taken to jail. The symbiote would later return to Eddie and break him out of prison, but it would leave behind a remnant in the process. This is the first chronological case of Venom reproducing, as a little chunk of symbiote was left behind in that cell, going on to bond with Venom's cellmate, a man named Cletus Cassidy. This is the origin of Carnage. As we talked about in the biology section, Carnage and Cletus have a perfect symbiote bond. This may be because they bonded almost immediately after Carnage's birth. That would make sense, though I'm honestly not sure if that's 100% canon. It makes sense though, so that's what I'm going to go with. We will come back to Carnage in a bit, as he is a major player in some stories that happen later, but for the next couple years of his appearances, he is just a more brutal, scary version of Venom, in stark contrast to what Venom himself is doing during this period. After the prison break, Venom moves to San Francisco and decides to turn their life around, joining the side of good. They are still extremely violent during this, of course, but they are an anti-hero at least, earning them the now iconic title of Lethal Protector. Once again, a lot of storylines happen during this era, but sticking to the symbiote lore at large, there is one major thing that we need to cover, that being Venom's involvement with the Life Foundation. The Life Foundation in the comics began as essentially a bunch of very rich doomsday preppers. They were interested in the symbiote as a possible way to protect themselves in the event of an apocalypse, so they captured Venom and experimented on him. In the process of this, they pulled off something very interesting, which was forcing the symbiote reproductive cycle. By making Venom generate symbiote seeds, they gave birth to 5 more symbiotes, which were given the code names of Riot, Lasher, Phage, Agony, and Scream, commonly referred to collectively as the Life Foundation symbiotes. The majority of these symbiotes don't have a lot of lore. You will usually see the Life Foundation symbiotes as a collective bonded to like villain henchmen or a military black ops group or something like that. They are often used as the some group is weaponizing symbiotes characters and aren't much beyond that. However, Scream is the only one that managed to find independent success, and is one of the very few symbiotes outside of Venom and Carnage to actually hold her own self-titled books. The miniseries Scream: Curse of Carnage is very good, and I would highly recommend it. Moving on from the Life Foundation, at some point after this, the Venom symbiote very briefly bonded to Eddie's ex-wife, Anne Weying. This was not a long period of time, but it's going to be incredibly important later, so just remember that it happened. Now we're going to pivot entirely for a moment and detour into a special segment that might end up getting cut from the video if this runs too long. So if you're hearing this, congratulations, I decided not to cut it. Let's talk about symbiote natural predators. As a species, symbiotes are not necessarily the top of the food chain. There are 2 things out in space that will eat them. The first is the xenophages. These are, in the comics, not important at all. Xenophages barely appear ever, but the reason I want to bring them up here is that they are villains in the 3rd Venom movie, so I thought it was worth mentioning. In the movie, the xenophages are just a different type of Knull's monsters and used to control rogue symbiotes. That is not the case in the comics. In the comics, they are just a different breed of alien that eats symbiotes. Nothing really fancy there. So then why did I make this a whole special segment instead of just slotting in xenophages when they appear in the timeline? Well, the other symbiote predator is a lot weirder. Let's talk about the poisons. The poisons are a small parasitic species originating on Earth 17952, so nowhere near the main Marvel universe of Earth 616. In their natural state, they are small but quite creepy, kind of looking like part skeleton, part flower monsters. The feeding cycle of a poison is extremely weird because they hunt very specific things. To feed, poisons need to bond not just with a symbiote, but with a symbiote and host pairing, essentially inserting themselves as a third party into that dynamic. When a poison inserts themselves into a bond, they gain full control over the other minds. The host and symbiote consciousness are totally suppressed, and the poison runs everything, including the natural abilities of both of the other organisms. This makes them extremely dangerous to symbiotes as a whole, and after dominating their home reality with this ability, they began to spread across the multiverse, taking over every symbiote that they find. This leads to the comic called Venomverse. Now, this might seem incredibly important, right? The fact that the symbiotes have multiverse traveling super predators seems very vital to their lore. But here's the thing. Venomverse and the poisons are really just there to be cool. To be clear, I'm not criticizing this. Comic books are comic books. They can do things just for the sake of cool. But yeah, that is absolutely what the poisons are. They have only appeared in a couple of comics, and they don't really have greater lore ramifications outside of that. They exist just because, because poison versions of characters look incredibly awesome. When you read the Venomverse comics, it becomes immediately apparent that the only reason these were written is because the designs are just incredibly cool to look at, and the creators wanted an excuse to make more of them. And so, since that is the point, I'll just show you a bunch of the designs. I've got a scroll of them going across the screen right now. This is nowhere near all of them. There are a ton, because the poisons only exist to showcase poison designs. I cannot make that obvious enough, but hey, the designs are good, I'll give them that. And there we go, that's all I really wanted to do for the Symbiote Predator section. Now that I've addressed it, let's get back to Venom's history. After the bond with Anne, one more symbiote is split off, though this one is not Venom's offspring in the traditional sense. This one, which would go on to become the superhero Mania, is a literal clone of Venom. It was grown from a piece of Venom's tongue. At some point during this period, Eddie decided that he could no longer stomach the symbiote's bloodlust and, sold it at a supervillain auction, which seems like it's not something that he should be able to easily do, but whatever, that's what happened. This was later bought by a member of an organized crime family who attempted to give it to his son, and attempted is the key word here. When the crime boss bonded Venom to his son Angelo, this partnership worked for a very brief period of time before Venom realized that Angelo was a loser and abandoned him in the middle of a web swing, leaving Angelo to plummet to his death. This is not relevant to symbiote lore at large, it's just funny enough that I wanted to bring it up. From here, the symbiote ended up with Mac Gargan, more commonly known as the Scorpion, and Mac became the main Venom for a while. He was still an anti-hero like this, technically, but far more on the anti-side, working with Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers and a more sinister incarnation of the Thunderbolts. This is also the period where Eddie becomes Anti-Venom, which we already covered. Now, I've been speedrunning this a little bit because this era of Venom is the one that has the least lore about the symbiotes as a whole, but I do need to pause and spend a little bit more time on this next host because we are finally at Agent Venom. Most of us know Flash Thompson in some capacity. It might be from the movies, where he's basically an entirely different character, but in the comics, he started out as Peter Parker's athletic high school bully, but he had quite a character arc going forward from there. This isn't even a recent thing either. Peter Parker and Flash Thompson made up with each other decades ago during their college days, with Flash acknowledging that he was kind of a jerk back in high school and the two becoming friends. Flash would then go on to join the military, and tragically during his time here, he was gravely injured to the point of losing both of his legs below the knee. As an amputee, Flash became incredibly depressed, but was shortly approached by the military once more. Not the same branch that he had previously worked with, this was a secret operation called Project Rebirth 2.0, which was an extension of the Sim Soldier program used in Vietnam. After the defeat of Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers, the Venom symbiote was removed from Mac Gargan and taken into military custody. There, they tested it, learning that there was a 48-hour window where the symbiote could not bond with its host in a lasting way. This created a sort of safe period in which somebody could bond with the symbiote for up to 2 days with no adverse mental effects or risk of permanent attachment. The bond was just as powerful though. The symbiote's full range of abilities were available to its host, and since the symbiote can control its own matter to form different body types, this meant that it could restore Flash's legs. Thus begins one of the coolest arcs in Venom history, with Flash Thompson using the symbiote to be a superhero like his idol Spider-Man, while also regaining his full mobility during the limited periods of time that he can use the powers. Notably, Venom was not happy with this arrangement, at least not during the early periods. As a failsafe, the military was also injecting the symbiote with various suppressing drugs, so Venom was mad about the whole thing, didn't fully understand what was going on, and when those drugs wore off for short lengths of time, he would revert to his monstrous form. However, as Flash and Venom got to know each other better, they realized that they were extremely compatible. Flash also provided a very nice narrative contrast to Eddie in terms of his relationship with Spider-Man. Venom is extremely obsessed with Spider-Man, that's been true for a while. Eddie was also obsessed with the hero, but in a more violent, antagonistic way. On the other side of this, Flash Thompson idolized Peter and wanted to be the same type of hero that he was, and this allowed the symbiote to explore that side of their relationship, becoming even more heroic in the process. Once again, we're going to have to skip over a lot of stories for time here because Agent Venom was not a singular arc. Flash Thompson was the main Venom for many years and was extremely popular. To this day, there are a lot of people who understandably prefer Flash as a Venom host over Eddie. The one other arc that we really need to address during this time for larger lore is Venom's time with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Yeah, Venom was a Guardian for a while. This is where the Venom Space Knight stuff happens. At Captain America's request, which shows just how trustworthy Flash was as a superhero, Venom became the Avengers liaison on the Guardians of the Galaxy and had a whole bunch of space adventures, gaining this more armored look in the process. This comic is the one that establishes a lot of the early lore around Clintar, which we have largely already covered. Of course, at this point the stuff with Knull was not added yet, that would happen years later, but Venom Space Knight is what establishes the symbiotes as an alien species beyond just Venom and a few isolated others. This is also where the Agents of the Cosmos make their first chronological appearance. I mentioned them a while ago and said they had one very important role. It is in this arc. They are the group that really establishes that Venom can be an independent hero because he's not just an evil blob of space goo, he is a member of a species, and therefore he can do whatever he wants. And what he wants to do in this time is be a good guy. Venom is not even an anti-hero during this period, he is just a straight-up good guy. Unfortunately for the symbiote, this would not last, as eventually Flash Thompson would return to Earth, and shortly after doing that, the symbiote would get corrupted. There were two factors to this. First, a bitter reunion with Spider-Man, which did not go very well, and secondly, more literal magic corruption at the hands of this demonic sigil called the Hell Mark. Thanks to both of these events, Venom went on a little bit of a rampage separated from Flash, but even once the corruption was toned down, he did not return to his favorite host out of pure shame. In a dark but surprisingly sad and interesting twist, it turns out that Venom liked being violent. Even though he was being more heroic around this period, there was still some part of him that liked that lethal protector era. He liked being a protector, but he liked being lethal just as much, and this corruption had reminded him of his more violent-based tendencies. He was so ashamed of this fact that he refused to return to Flash, thinking that the man deserved something better than what Venom apparently was at his core. Thus, the symbiote was taken into government custody again, but before it could be turned over to a new host, it was broken out by Eddie Brock. And so, Venom and Eddie Brock were reunited once more, as a hero, but as the lethal protector anti-hero status quo, which had mixed reviews from the fans. A lot of people really like Flash Thompson Agent Venom and did not like Return to the Old Form, but I'm an Eddie Brock fan, so I personally didn't mind it. As I've done several times, here's the obligatory acknowledgement that many independent Venom arcs happen during this time, though we have already addressed a couple of them, as this is when the poisons show up. And we're about to change sections of the video entirely. However, there is one more very important piece of Venom lore that we need to address before we move on to the next chapter, that being Venom's seventh child. Remember Tel-Kar and the comic Venom First Host? While that comic does tell the story of Venom's first host, that happens in a flashback, and most of the miniseries takes place in the present with Tel-Kar returning to Earth. This is where we get the seventh kid. In response to a coming crisis, which we are about to talk about, the Venom symbiote had started another reproductive cycle, and Tel-Kar, coincidentally, had found it around the same time. He had arrived on Earth with intent to claim his old symbiote back, but Venom didn't really want to do that. Therefore, Tel-Kar, in his mild insanity, tried to capture the young symbiote instead. They get into a whole fight about this, and it ends with Tel-Kar actually kind of getting what he wanted, as he does end up bonded to the new symbiote, which is named Sleeper. Yes, the cool chemical powers one that I mentioned briefly in the symbiote biology section. Sleeper and Tel-Kar are bonded, but Sleeper is absolutely in control, as shortly after the bond happens, the symbiote lobotomizes its host and flies out into space to go on independent adventures. He will make a reappearance later, so we will come back to him, but for now I want to go into another sidebar section, though not completely disconnected from the lore, as this is a very important thing. We need to talk about Venom's family tree. As you may have picked up on, most of the Venom-specific storylines I've been covering are either the ones where he bonds to a new host, or the ones where he generates a new symbiote entirely. This is because the amount of symbiotes on Earth is about to be very important, and so I think the family tree is both relevant and also just kind of fun to see. I have made a whole diagram for this, though I'm also going to give you a peek behind the curtain and admit that I am recording the audio of this section before making the diagram. So this might be a little bit weird, but I'm going to do my best. This is actually going to be kind of fun, as I'm basically just narrating instructions to myself, and then I will listen to this as I go through and make the actual picture later. But regardless, we will begin at the top with Knull. Knull is the progenitor of the symbiote race, and then 998 generations later, we get Venom. Most of the tree under this is going to be Venom's offspring in one way or another. Now, there are going to be symbiotes that we haven't mentioned in this video on this picture because I wanted the image to be complete. Some of them we will talk about later, others just aren't relevant to symbiote lore as a whole, but still, this is the complete history. Venom's first direct offspring is the Carnage symbiote. Carnage then goes on to have 3 children of his own: Toxin, Scorn, and Raise. Carnage is also partially responsible for the creation of another symbiote named Rascal, with the other part of this symbiote coming from one named Bedlam. We will definitely be talking about Bedlam later. I would say that he's not on this diagram, but he technically is. Just wait, and that will eventually make sense. Venom's next batch of children are the Life Foundation symbiotes, the 5 siblings that were forcibly extracted from him. These again are Scream, Lasher, Phage, Agony, and Riot. None of the Life Foundation symbiotes go on to have any offspring of their own, so this is the end of their lines. Though in true comic book fashion, despite them not having any offspring, this is not where the diagram is going to end, because the Life Foundation symbiotes, and occasionally Toxin, have fused into a collective symbiote on a few occasions. The first time this happened, they formed a new entity called Hybrid, and the second time they formed a different one called Madness. These are treated like separate symbiotes, but they're also kind of not. I'm just going to stick them on the bottom of the tree and then we're going to call it good. Finally, we have Sleeper, who I just recently mentioned. Sleeper is Venom's youngest kid. He was also born directly from the symbiote in response to an upcoming crisis, and he also has no offspring. Technically, Venom has another biological child. This one is named Dylan Brock. Now, immediately, something seems weird about this. That's a normal human name instead of edgy words like every other symbiote is named. But this is not Eddie Brock's family tree, this is Venom's. So, what's going on there? Well, don't worry, Dylan Brock is going to be a main character for like the rest of this video, so we will explain every detail. Moving on from more traditional children, we have other genetic offshoots, which Future Show Superhero, put this on the left, that seems good. The main one here is a symbiote that I will call Mania. I briefly mentioned Mania already. This was a clone of Venom grown from part of its own tongue. Technically, it is not a different symbiote because it's just Venom again, but while it was being worn, the person wearing it used the code name of Mania, so calling it the Mania symbiote is easier. Then there's a section that I'm just going to call like nebulous duplicates. I'm going to be honest here, cloning Venom is a very easy thing for a comic to do, and typically it only matters for like a single issue or a single arc. So there are a lot of other minor symbiotes that don't matter, which are technically Venom's children, and I'm just going to lump them all into this bubble. Also on the left of this section, we have Sliver. I am putting Sliver over here because I have absolutely no idea what is going on with this one. Sliver is a symbiote that has only recently been bonded to Black Widow, and it has been openly stated as a connected symbiote to Venom, but we don't know how exactly. It does not seem to be a clone, as it both looks and acts differently, but it's also not treated as one of Venom's direct kids, and with how that canon is established to work, that wouldn't really make any sense. So, I mean, it's on the tree because it deserves to be there, and that's going to be good enough. I'm not going to elaborate. Unfortunately, I also have to do this again because there is another new symbiote in the same category. This one is Flicker, and it is a symbiote that has some connection to Alchemax. Some connection is the best that I can say, because Flicker has no lore whatsoever. This is the page where Flicker is introduced. It literally just says, "and introducing Flicker," and there is no more. I don't know what's going on. It seems connected to the Life Foundation symbiotes in some way, which means it's probably related to Venom. Whatever, it looks cool, I like the color scheme, so I guess I'll just accept that it's here. Looking cool is kind of all that matters for side character symbiotes. And then finally, we will move to the right side of the diagram, which is the anti-symbiotes. Now, strictly speaking, I didn't need to put the anti-symbiotes on this tree because they are not symbiotes, but again, I thought it would be fun, and fun is the point of all this, so why not slap them on there? The first of this kind is Anti-Venom, which was created when Venom's biomass was exposed to the power of Mr. Negative. This symbiote would later be destroyed. However, through scientific experimentation, a second version of it was created. This is technically a different symbiote, but it's also just called Anti-Venom. I think the sort of unofficial name for it is simply Anti-Venom 2. And then from there, the process used to make Anti-Venom 2 has been done on matter from other symbiotes. We have an Anti-Scream named Silence, and an Anti-Carnage named Misery. So this, zooming back out, is the entire Venom family tree, or at least most of them. Honestly, I would not be surprised if I missed a minor one, but hey, that's what the weird nebulous clones section exists for. As you can see, this is very, very large. There are a lot of symbiotes on Earth, and most of them have ties to Venom in one way or another. And as if this was not big enough, remember that this is just the symbiotes themselves and not the hosts. So if you want to talk about actual symbiote activity on Earth, this is only one small piece of the puzzle, as most of these symbiotes have been bonded to multiple people over the course of their history. Venom alone has been bonded to a lot. At this point, basically everyone important in the Marvel Universe has been bonded to a symbiote for at least some period of time, and this is the catalyst for things in the symbiote world really going off the rails. Let's call back to the section on symbiote biology, because there is a part of that that I withheld for dramatic purposes. A big point of that, and in fact a big point of symbiotes as a whole, is that the bond they have with their host goes both ways. The host mind and body can influence the symbiote, but the symbiote influences the host as well, and this continues even after the bond is done. This is going to be something of a twist, but at this point we need to introduce a new character to this storyline. A very important one, but also one that has not mattered to symbiotes at all up until this point. The Maker. Yes, like evil alternate universe Reed Richards, the Maker. The Maker had been studying symbiotes for quite some time as part of something he was working on called Project Oversight. He had a theory that symbiotic bonds could help individuals survive travel between universes, and that was a big goal of his as he was from the original Ultimates universe and he wanted to get back there. Don't worry too much about that plotline, it kind of got cancelled before it went anywhere, and the new Ultimates is largely unconnected, at least at the time of this recording. That aside, something that he discovered during this process is extremely relevant to the symbiotes. The Maker had a big revelation in his research when, the Grendel symbiote escaped. Remember how the government had a gigantic symbiote dragon held hostage? Of course, that was not going to stay there the entire time. It breaks out, Venom fights it, and the Maker gets his hands on some of the samples. If you'll recall, symbiotes were originally designed as agents of corruption in the service of Knull, and while they have grown far beyond that singular purpose, parts of that remain in their evolutionary biology. The most key feature of that is something called a symbiote codex. When a symbiote bonds to a host, even if it's for the briefest period of time, a little piece of living abyss matter is left on that person's spine. This functions as a little transmitter to the symbiote hive mind, keeping a record of that person, their personality, their memories, their skills and abilities, etc., and in theory, transmitting it to Knull. Of course, Knull is suppressed at this point, and so it's not really going anywhere, but even though there's nothing receiving the signal, the codices were still around. The Maker didn't really care about this. That was not something relevant to Project Oversight, it was just a thing that he discovered in his research and therefore had in his records. And then, his records were stolen by remaining members of the Cult of Knull. Yeah, remember that cult from centuries ago that was still around? It is suddenly very important again. At this point, it was being led by Carnage, who they saw as a sort of dark prophet of their ancient god, and when Carnage found out about the codices, he got a devious little idea. One codex on its own is absolutely nothing. It is a signal to the hive mind, sure, but it's like a single blinking LED at the bottom of the ocean. There are so many other symbiotes out there in this residual hive mind structure that nobody is going to notice one codex being weird. But this is on Earth, and as we've already established, Earth happens to have a lot of symbiotes and a lot of action in which symbiotes are bonded to people. This means that Earth has a lot of codexes, and sure, one codex might not be very important, but if you can amass a lot of them, if you can link those signals together, then it might send out enough of a shockwave that you can talk to God. Now we reach 2019's Absolute Carnage event, which revolves around the symbiote amassing codexes by literally ripping them out of people's spines and slamming them together in hopes of creating a strong enough signal that it will punch through Clintar and reach the mind of Knull. This is a badass concept for a Venom story, though I have to be honest, the event itself is fine. There are a lot of Absolute Carnage books, but most of them just revolve around Carnage creating a bunch of weird clones of himself and then infecting a lot of other superheroes. They don't really matter for the grand storyline at large, but there is a kind of funny reason for this. The writer of this comic, and the Venom comic that introduced Knull and a lot of this other King in Black stuff, Donny Cates, has said before that he did not originally intend for Absolute Carnage to be an event. It was first just going to be one arc of the Venom series, but then when he pitched it to Marvel, they were like, hey, it would be cool if we did tie-ins to this. Do you want to make it an entire event? And he said, sure. This is actually great for my purposes though, because it means that while there are so many comics under the umbrella of Absolute Carnage, most of them are kind of just fights, and so I don't really have to talk about them. If you want to read symbiote fights, you can go read them, but the main line and the Venom series are the only ones that really affect the lore. Now, I should note that, as I briefly mentioned earlier, this was technically not Knull's first influence on Earth. That happened with the dragon. The dragon gave him like a residual connection, which gave him a tiny, tiny little way of putting his mind back into the hive there, but this did not last for long because, well, the symbiotes that were connected to the dragon did not really last for long either. This would reignite some of the cult stuff and some other symbiote research, however, and that would lead to Carnage trying this plan, so really this is just the US military's fault because they shouldn't have been experimenting on an alien dragon. This is also the era where we get introduced to Dylan Brock, who I briefly mentioned earlier and kind of promised would be weird. So let me explain what's so weird about Venom's strangest kid. Dylan Brock is a human symbiote hybrid, which, yes, is a thing that can happen, though I believe Dylan is the first and only example of it. Actually, I get to do two callbacks in very rapid succession here. Remember when I super briefly mentioned that Venom bonded to Eddie's ex-wife, and then I was like, that's gonna be important later, remember that was a thing. It's a thing now. Dylan Brock technically has 3 biological parents, those being Eddie Brock, Anne Weying, and the Venom symbiote itself. The way that that is possible is that when Venom was bonded to Anne, God, this is going to be really weird to say, the symbiote impregnated her using residual samples of Eddie Brock's DNA. This led to Dylan being born by what seemed to be a normal human pregnancy, and Eddie and Anne just kind of thinking that he was their normal biological child. However, that was not the case, and though he seemed human, he actually had symbiote powers. When it comes to the symbiote species, Dylan functions kind of like a mini version of Knull. This kid has complete control over the symbiotes. He can sense their presence, he can control their forms, and he can even pilot them remotely through the hive mind just like Knull could. This allows him to do some absolutely insane stuff that we have not seen symbiotes be able to do before. In one case, Dylan forced a symbiote without a host to assume the form of a T-Rex that could then fight for him. God, Dylan Brock is really cool, actually. I love this kid. Though kid is a very important part of that, Dylan Brock is still young. We don't know his exact age because comic timelines are weird, but he is probably somewhere within the range of 10 to 15 in current canon, and because of some events that we'll talk about later, he does not currently have access to his full powers. This is probably a good thing though, as we have seen adult versions of Dylan in alternate universes, and in at least some of them, he grows up to become a world-conquering supervillain named Codex. Anyway, back to Absolute Carnage, there is less here that we have to talk about than you might think. The main twists of Absolute Carnage are first off the introduction of Dylan and exploring a bit more of his origin, and secondly, the ending of it. Carnage, right in the climax of this, gets a huge power boost from Knull, which makes him look incredibly cool. I mean, this is one of the most emo and edgy designs I've ever seen for a supervillain, but I cannot deny that it absolutely rules. Despite how cool he looks, Carnage does lose at the end of this. He is beaten by Venom, but the damage is already done. Even though Carnage is defeated, he has collected enough codices that he has punched a little psychic hole through Clintar as he originally intended. This gives Knull a little window from which he can extend his influence, and he breaks out of the planet entirely, setting a course for Earth. Now we get to one of, if not the biggest events in Venom history, King in Black. Knull does not waste a moment of time in restoring his former glory, which is a lot easier than you might think it is, actually, because, well, I'll put it this way. Caging a dark, hive mind controlling god in a prison made of his own minions is a very cool idea that worked for a while, but the second there's a notable crack in that prison, I mean, he just reclaimed control of the hive mind and all of the symbiotes on Clintar immediately, so Knull was back as a threat. The Abyss army begins spreading across the galaxy, and we do get to see a couple comics of them being a problem for other planets, but Earth is the main target because the guy who defeated Knull previously is there, and he is well established to be very petty. The first issue of the King in Black event is basically just hype for Knull's invasion and how massive it is, which, yeah, it is absolutely massive. He brings dragons, a whole bunch of dragons. Each of those dragons can also spawn symbiotes on its own, and we get to see the first look at a larger unit in Knull's army, which is Symbiote Corrupted Celestials. Yeah, he did that at some point in the past, which, again, I guess does make sense. His whole thing is that he's very petty and mad at the Celestials. If he was given a chance to overtake a couple of them, he would absolutely do so. But even the corrupted Celestials are not Earth's biggest problem at the moment. Nothing in the symbiote hive mind is, because in this case, its master has come along with them. Knull is seeing to this matter personally. He has also managed to restore All Black to his control, and therefore, well, let me just show you. When the Avengers call in their greatest failsafe, the Sentry, Knull rips Bob Reynolds in half. This isn't even after a fight. He takes one sucker punch from the Sentry and then immediately turns and just deals with that problem in a second, which I have to admit is really stupid. So now I'm going to break the flow of King in Black for a second just because I have to go on a rant about this. So as cool as this moment is, it shouldn't have happened, and I don't mean that in a power-scale-y, Knull cannot beat the Sentry way. I mean in a narrative sense, this is not something that should have worked with how the canon is established. In the time shortly before King in Black, Sentry was doing other things. He had this whole narrative going on where he had merged with the Void temporarily, unifying his powers and becoming way stronger as he finally gained full control over them. Of course, being the Sentry, this caused a whole host of other problems. This led to him going into the negative zone for a while, and he actually remained in the negative zone because he was using his power to safeguard this universe as his risk of the Void had almost killed it previously. We're not going to go into huge detail on this because it has nothing to do with symbiotes, and that's kind of the point. Sentry was doing his own thing. He was not related to Venom at all, and they never establish how his previous storyline transitions into being here for the Venom event. And the reason that they never establish it is that nobody actually cared. Donny Cates, who wrote this event, has gone on record and admitted that he just wanted to put Sentry in this because he thought it was cool, and he didn't really do research on how this worked or if it made any sense. And I guess editorial just let it happen. So Sentry's appearance here is a callback, if nothing else. I will give Donnie this, he did not choose Bob arbitrarily. There's a famous panel from years prior where Sentry beats Carnage by ripping him in half, and then this shot with Knull and Sentry is almost the exact same. So basically this is the symbiotes getting revenge, and screwing over Sentry's narrative in the process, because he stayed dead, and the next couple comics, while more interesting and working with what they had, did have to deal with the fact that Sentry was dead. Anyway, my little rant about this aside, Earth is pretty much screwed at this point, because if Knull can one-shot the Sentry, what is anybody else on the planet going to do to him and an army of invading symbiotes? The classic symbiote weaknesses also don't even work in this case, because remember, fire and sound are now established to be a weird kind of generational fear reaction in the symbiotes. Knull does not have that because he is not a symbiote himself, and since he's exerting direct control over the invasion forces, they don't have the weaknesses either. The only form of direct attack that seems to have any effect on Knull is lightning, which does make sense with what's already been established. Thor was able to break Knull's control over the hive mind by shocking a dragon with a big lightning bolt prior, but this is not going to work exactly the same when Knull is right there. Lightning does injure him at least a little bit, so that's something the heroes can use, but the reason it worked so well previously is that the shockwave through the hive mind was something Knull wasn't expecting. Now that he's there in person, he can tank a couple of lightning bolts, and so the pattern continues. Earth is screwed. And yeah, it is just screwed. There's not a but coming after that. Most of King in Black is the heroes fighting on the back foot after the invasion is successful. Knull then creates a symbiote-like shell around the entire planet, cutting it off from sunlight and amplifying his own power even further. At this point, Knull can let his army finish the work of corrupting all the population on Earth before moving on to take over the rest of the galaxy. But there is one more thing that he has to handle. After all, the only reason Knull appeared here in person was to settle a grudge, and he wants to find Brock. Now, you'd think this might be easy. Symbiotes have a hive mind. It is something I have mentioned many times over the course of this video. But there is another element to it that I have not mentioned yet, being that Venom is actually not connected to that hive mind. Kinda. I haven't brought it up because the canon status of this is absolutely a mess. Remember that Knull and the hive mind and everything are a relatively recent addition to the lore, and so none of the canon before that makes sense. Making things even worse, the hive mind was introduced before Knull was, and so this all came in stages, and it's been described a billion different ways. Most of the other decades-long canon questions have kind of settled on an answer. This one hasn't, as well as the others do. There are many reasons why Venom is or is not connected to the hive mind. The best way I can describe it is that he, and therefore his descendants, are not part of the hive mind unless they are, which is sometimes. I don't want to get into more detail than that because it would take way too long. For purposes of this and everything going forward, Venom has been severed from the hive mind this entire time, and that is why Knull could not just control him directly, except for the one time he did, which we're not going to worry about. This individual symbiote was maybe a trick up the sleeve that the heroes could use, but every single other trick they've been trying has not worked at all, and so with no other options, Venom and Eddie reconnect to the hive mind willingly, sharing their location to Knull so that they can talk. Knull arrives and Venom attempts to negotiate with him. After all, the only reason Knull cares about Earth so much is because of that personal grudge. So Venom says that if Knull will leave the planet alone, he will go with him willingly. This confuses Knull more than anything else, as he looks at the host under his wayward symbiote child and realizes he should have clarified which Brock he was mad at. Yeah, Knull doesn't give a shit about Eddie Brock. Eddie is just a guy, but Dylan Brock, Dylan is something special, and for the entirety of this series, he has been screwing up symbiotes left and right. He was instrumental in defeating Carnage when he was connecting to Knull. He turned a symbiote into a T-Rex a while ago. Dylan has proven control over the symbiote hive mind, and that makes him a threat. Knull does know who Eddie is, of course. They have had run-ins before, but he doesn't really view him as anything serious. He only wants to get at Eddie's kid. So Knull simply strips the symbiote from Eddie's body and then drops him off a building. And Eddie dies. This is a cliffhanger at the end of the comic where it shows him plummeting to his death, and yeah, he does die at the end of this. It is not a fake out. Of course, this is comic books, so he gets better, but while Eddie is recovering, or I don't know if you could call what he's doing recovering per se, but we will get to it, let's talk about what everybody else is doing during the process. King in Black as a comic event is very similar to what Absolute Carnage was, but just kind of better. While Abscarn, as it is sometimes called, was just a bunch of symbiote corruption and fights, King in Black is a bunch of symbiote corruption and fights that have a narrative thread linking them all. A lot of the comics are about isolated heroes and sometimes villains fighting off symbiotes wherever in the world they are based, because this was absolutely a global spanning event. But there are others that are more connected to the resistance against Knull as a whole. For example, there's a miniseries where the Thunderbolts are trying to transport Sentry's corpse to one of Knull's bases of operations so that they can use him like a super bomb. We don't have to go into detail on a lot of these tie-ins, but there is one that I need to talk about because it is way more important to the larger narrative than all of the others, that being the King in Black Valkyries comic. So remember how Knull decapitated that Celestial a while ago and the skull went on to become his forge and then later nowhere? Did you ever wonder what happened to the body of that Celestial? This comic answers that question. Because Celestials are weird cosmic things that are largely unmoored from the laws of logic and geography, somehow, while the head stayed in the physical realm, the body of the Celestial drifted into the afterlife, or like a weird middle afterlife realm, where it started functioning as an anchor point for All Black. Apparently, every time All Black killed anything, the symbiotic properties of the sword would trap that being's soul and then send it to this celestial corpse. This was why the blade was so incredibly strong. It was feeding on the souls of its victims the entire time. So the Valkyries, beings who can travel in and out of the afterlife, are sent in as a special kind of strike force to sever this connection. This does work, and All Black loses its cosmic battery, which admittedly was something that they kind of needed to do. From a publication standpoint, All Black was introduced years before Knull was, during the Gore the God Butcher arc, and then they established its origin as a symbiote thing after that. This meant that All Black on its own kind of had a villainous history, and so if they wanted Knull to be treated as a villain independently, they needed to kill All Black separately, and Valkyries did that part. The last King in Black side thing going on I want to talk about before we return to the story of the Brox and Knull specifically is what Iron Man was doing, because early in this event, he gets a sample of Knull-empowered symbiote and combines it with his own extremist tech to create the Extremebiote armor, which is maybe one of the coolest suits in Tony's entire history. Also, he can control its shape because it's part symbiote, so he turns it into a dragon at one point, and then turns it into a celestial at one point. Though this is, of course, something very specific to this event, he does not get to keep this thing long term because it relies on Knull. Though I didn't just bring up the Extremebiote armor because it's cool, I brought it up because I wanted more of a narrative transition into this comic, where Iron Man and Doctor Doom team up to fight a venomized version of Santa. It's not like relevant to the plot, it's just a funny little side thing they did, and of course they do leave it intentionally ambiguous as to whether this was the real Santa or a mall Santa of some kind. Anyway, Eddie Brock is dead, or, dead in air quotes, but by comic standards, that's good enough, meaning that Dylan Brock is now officially the most important person on the planet. He is the only one that can directly remove symbiotes from people, meaning that Knull was right to be afraid of him. However, as the event progresses, Knull's feelings on the subject change a little bit. As Knull is able to view Dylan in action more directly, he realizes that they have some similarities. Both of them are not true symbiotes, at least not entirely, yet they both have the ability to control these things that Knull views as lesser creatures. And, of course, as a part symbiote himself, Dylan and Knull are directly related by blood, or whatever symbiote matter has instead of blood. This means that in many ways, Dylan is sort of Knull's son. During their confrontation, Dylan causes a little bit of a feedback loop within the hive mind that does not incapacitate Knull, but it does distract him for long enough that Jean Grey of the X-Men can telepathically enter his mind and find a weakness. Now, we need to stop the video for a second and call back way to something in the first section that I talked about. Think back to like an hour and a half ago when I was talking about the King in Black. Not Knull specifically, but the King in Black as a role, as a multiversal protector working opposite to the Kings in White. Knull rejected the duties of that role, of course. He didn't want them in the first place, and so he twisted the Living Abyss to his own ends. But remember that the Living Abyss was not technically his to control. That was a primordial force, the tool of the Kings in Black as a collective, and the Kings in White also had a parallel tool. Now, the Kings in White floating outside existence weren't really getting involved in what was happening on Earth at the time. They are a multiversal organization, and the entire reason that they needed a parallel job was because they were not great at responding to tiny threats like Knull was compared to the scale of all existence. But their tool was still working. This tool, which I previously referred to as the Unipower, had some sentience in and of itself, so it was aware of Knull's invasion of Earth and wanted to do something to stop it. Thus, it had begun making its way there as well. Now, what do you think this is? Because a lot of you have probably heard of it at least in some capacity. This was not something new invented for the King in Black event, it was something old that was redefined. Before I reveal exactly what it is, let's compare it to Knull and his own power. Knull himself is a singular entity. There is one King in Black, but his power is multiple. He uses the Living Abyss to make symbiotes, and those symbiotes can spread, corrupting a large number of beings to Knull's will. From this, it makes sense that the powers of the Kings in White would work in an opposite way. It is called the Unipower after all. While the Kings in White are not singular, there are a bunch of Beyonders out there, their power as an opposite to the Living Abyss does not bond with and corrupt multitudes, it bonds with and empowers one. That's right, King in Black establishes that the tool used by the Kings in White is the force known commonly as Captain Universe. Now, let's briefly talk about that and its history within the comics as well. Captain Universe is a title used by a lot of different people situationally, but the most popular is more commonly known as Cosmic Spider-Man. This force first debuted in the 1980s, with no connection to Knull or the Symbiotes at the time, of course, and has been passed around to a whole bunch of people. The rough summary of how the mechanics of this thing work is that the Captain Universe energy will empower people in times of crisis and then leave. That's why a bunch of superheroes get it for short periods of time. It is crisis dependent. It is kind of just a deus ex machina, but it is treated like that. This is a power that heroes use to amplify themselves against a particular threat, and then it's gone. There are cases where one person will just become Captain Universe for an extended period of time, but the majority of times you'll see it, it is bonded to another hero. So then the Captain Universe powers, otherwise known as the Unipower or the Enigma Force, because everything cosmic in this series has a billion names, does kind of make sense as a form of symbiote. That is not the original writing intent, but it's an interesting evolution of the lore. Captain Universe is the tools of the Cosmic Kings working as it is supposed to. It is this outside force empowering people to do things needed to protect reality and the universe, and then it leaves. It's not meant to make consistent superheroes, it is crisis response. It is the tool that these cosmic entities use to basically put a band-aid on problems. Knull should have been using the Living Abyss to do that, but because he went off the rails, he was using it for corruption instead. The Enigma Force has been chasing Knull down since all the way back in his earliest days, attempting to restore balance to the cosmic forces. Then, when Knull got imprisoned in Clintar, well, he wasn't an active threat anymore, and so the power went off to do other things. Now that Knull is an active threat again, the Enigma Force is returning to Earth, and with the help of Silver Surfer, breaks through the barrier surrounding it to go to its new chosen host, who is, of course, Eddie Brock. Now again, Eddie was dead at the time, and he was actually legitimately dead. There's a whole scene where he succumbs to his injuries after falling off the building and does perish. But Eddie is connected to the symbiote hive mind. After all, he has a codex in him, and he has been bonded to a symbiote for one of the longest periods of time on the entire planet, so his connection to it runs very, very deep. Therefore, while his physical body died, his consciousness was sort of uploaded into a psychic space that contains that hive mind. While everyone else was fighting Knull, Eddie was going on his own little adventure within the symbiote hive mind, meeting the consciousness of Flash Thompson in the process. Yeah, there was no real good way for me to stick it in when it actually happened, but after losing the Venom symbiote, Flash had gained a second anti-Venom symbiote, becoming Agent Anti-Venom, and then he had died. But his consciousness was uploaded into the hive mind as well. I know anti-symbiotes are not connected to the hive mind, but this just kind of happened anyway. This would lead to Flash's later resurrection, as he was able to incarnate himself in a symbiote and then go restore his corpse using that same symbiote. So yay, he's back as Agent Anti-Venom, but let's not worry about him. Eddie's doing space things. There's a thing that happens in a lot of Donny Cates comics, which is not bad, but is absolutely acknowledged by a lot of the fan base as one of his writing signatures. That being that when he writes a character, there's going to come a point in that character's history where they get all the superpowers and become the coolest and strongest thing in the universe. That time has arrived for Venom. With his normal symbiote restored and the Enigma Force powering him up as Captain Universe, Eddie is able to somehow summon Mjolnir and the Silver Surfer's board to him as well, uniting them into a cosmic axe, becoming what is now commonly referred to as God of Light Venom. God of Light Venom wins. He beats Knull easily, though easily and quickly are not the same thing. The majority of this comic is just a gigantic fight sequence where Venom is kicking the shit out of Knull. I'm actually going to go through and count here. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 pages that are just a long, non-stop sequence of Venom winning and winning and winning and winning. Not only that, in the entirety of this 13-page sequence, Venom does not take a single hit himself. It is just him hitting Knull and his minions over and over and over, culminating in him flying into space and plunging Knull's body into the heart of the sun, where the god of the symbiotes disintegrates. Now, I have heard criticism for the finale of King in Black before. A lot of people don't like that it does end with the Captain Universe power just kind of flying to Earth and then Venom getting everything and then just winning easily without much more depth to it. And you know what? That is kind of valid. Narratively, this is maybe not the best. However, this is comic books, and there are cases when a 13-page super badass fight sequence is completely okay. This is one of those cases. As cheesy and as stupid and as edgy 90s bullshit as it is, the end of King in Black is incredibly awesome. Now that Knull has been destroyed, his control over the hive mind is obviously gone with him, and that ends his invasion right then and there. There are still a lot of symbiotes on Earth, and that is something that will be explored in later comics, but they are no longer under the control of the Dark Tyrant, and so there is no more symbiote shell on Earth, no more dragons, etc., etc. From here, the comic actually ends very quickly, but it leads into the next chapter of symbiote history that we have to discuss, which is maybe going to be the most complicated of them. See, after defeating Knull, the role of King in Black does not just vanish into the ether, and under the circumstances, it goes to the person who killed him. This means that Eddie Brock himself is now the King in Black. The Donny Cates Venom series has one more issue after King in Black ends, called Venom 200, not because this series was 200 issues long, but because this worked out that it was the 200th Venom solo comic ever published, which is kinda neat. The point of this is to just wrap up every hanging plot thread and also establish what the status quo of symbiotes would be going forward, though a lot of it will change in the subsequent issues. Still, I want to cover it as it was presented here. For one, Flash Thompson is alive again. I mentioned that he became Agent Anti-Venom once more, and this is where we get to see that. The next event for him would be one called Extreme Carnage, which is dealing with the fallout of Knull's invasion failing. As I mentioned, there are a bunch more symbiotes on Earth now because of that, and Flash is one of the people assisting with it. Secondly, the Venom symbiote itself actually does not stay with Eddie. As the King in Black, he's doing other stuff that we'll talk about in just a second, but the specific Venom symbiote goes to Dylan, meaning that Dylan Brock is Venom for a while going forward. He uses chains instead of webs, because again, this is extremely edgy on purpose, but I like Dylan as Venom. He's very fun. I should also note that Dylan's whole symbiote controlling powers are weakened at this point, as his dad separates him from the hive mind because it's way too much of a burden for a little kid to have. He will regain some of them later, but at this point he's just like a normal symbiote human bond. And as for Eddie, well, Eddie is now in charge of the entire symbiote hive mind across everywhere, and while he's not going to be using it as a tyrant like Knull did, he is using it for good as best he can. Venom 200 shows Eddie piloting symbiotes around various regions of Earth and space, using the Clintar as peacekeeping agents to help whoever is in need. He does this consensually for what it's worth. It's not like he's directly taking over the minds of sentient beings like Knull did, he's just kind of hopping in and lending his expertise. Unfortunately, human bodies are simply not designed for this level of symbiotic input, and the feedback is taking quite a toll on Eddie's mind and his body. Venom 200 establishes that being the King in Black is aging Eddie at an incredibly accelerated pace, and this is where the issue ends. Flash is back, Dylan is Venom, and Eddie is very powerful, but there are consequences of that we're going to have to deal with. They are dealt with in the next Venom series. The Venom series that began in 2021, written by Al Ewing and Ram V, is a twofold one at the start. It happens in two places at once. On Earth, following Dylan's adventures as Venom, and then let's just say elsewhere following Eddie's, because again, this is going to be symbiote lore. For the beginning of this series, we're going to be focusing more on Eddie's part. Venom's adventures on Earth are more like street level stuff. In issue 1 of this comic, we get to see Eddie doing one of his now normal space missions. He has a small strike team of symbiotes that he is hopping back and forth between, saving several aliens. But as this is going on, something very concerning happens. Partway through the operation, one of the symbiotes is severed from Eddie's control, goes on a murder rampage, delivers a cryptic message to the King in Black, and then dies. This is creepy enough on its own, and it's made extra creepy by the fact that this really should not happen. Knull is dead, the role of King in Black has fallen to Eddie. So who the hell can hijack the symbiote hive connection like this? Making things even worse yet again is the exact nature of the message that this mysterious hijacker delivers, telling Eddie that yeah, sure, he's the King in Black now, but his time on that throne is extremely limited. No other information is provided, and therefore Eddie decides to investigate. Unfortunately, he has no idea where to start. Eddie is still connected to the entire hive, and he cannot sense any external connections that might be this villain. At this point, though, he comes up with what I can really only call a crackpot theory. There is apparently a moment in the near future where Eddie stops being the King in Black, and if he can figure out what that is, maybe it will give him a clue as to how to avoid it and who caused this all to happen in the first place. And, well, if Eddie can use the hive mind to project his consciousness into any symbiote throughout space, why can't he use the hive mind to project his mind into any symbiote throughout time? This is where I am so grateful that this is a lore catch-up video for people wanting to learn about the Venom status quo and not a story summary, because let me tell you, this is a very complicated time travel arc that is not meant to be summarized. I'm going to give you the lore information that you need to hop into Venom from here going out, but I will also give this comic the credit that it is absolutely due and say that it is very good, and if you want to read it, I'm going to spoil the entire thing for you. So if you're interested in going in completely blind, you should stop this video now and read that before finishing it. Alright, with that out of the way, I'm going to begin this time travel arc by showing you another diagram. This one is going to lay out the timeline as easily as I can, and then I'll go through and explain various elements of it as we explain the details of the storyline, but I think it's helpful to have this visual reference in your mind. The best way that I can show you the timeline of the Al Ewing Venom arc is this. This is a good representation. I know this looks like a joke, and I mean, yeah, it is a joke, but it's also a little bit more literal than you might be expecting. This is a good picture of Eddie Brock's timeline in this comic, and I can hear at least one of you trying to be pedantic at me and say that this is not a good representation of one character's timeline because this is not one long spaghetti noodle, there's a bunch of noodles here. And yeah, I know what I'm showing you, that will make sense. Anyway, deciding to test out his wild idea, Eddie projects his mind into the future, and yeah, it does actually work, even better than he was expecting. He kind of overshoots his target and ends up in a very weird-looking location, which will later be known as the Garden of Time. Now, before we talk about what he finds here, there is one really important aspect of how Eddie's time travel works that I need to discuss, and I kind of already said it, but since it is very specific, I just want to lay it out plainly. Eddie Brock does not have the ability to time travel. That is not a thing that he can do. But what he can do is send his mind to occupy any existing symbiote matter. So it's not like a TARDIS where he can just go anywhere and anywhen. He can basically possess any symbiote wherever and whenever symbiotes happen to be. This, he very quickly learns, is not a feature that he was the only one to discover. This ability to control the hive mind throughout time is a property inherent to the role of King in Black, made very clear by the fact that Eddie is not the only King in Black present in this garden. Shortly after his arrival, Eddie is greeted by a strange being named Meridius, who also claims to be a King in Black, one from the distant future, sometime after Eddie has lost the role. Meridius then goes on to show him several others, named Finnegan, Bedlam, Wild, and Tyro, all of whom are legitimate kings in black that will all hold the throne at some point along the timeline. Because of the time weirdness that goes along with the King in Black, they will all eventually converge at the Garden of Time, which is one of the farthest points in the future of this reality. This is where I'm going to skip several issues ahead for the sake of lore and just spoil the entire thing for you. Turns out these future Kings in Black are not technically different Kings in Black, they are all Eddie Brock. The best comparison I can make is Doctor Who. These are Eddie at different stages of his existence. He will become all of these people, taking on their identities and their characteristics as he evolves. The best way to explain how exactly this functions is to just speedrun it very quickly in a linear order by the chronology of how it works. First off, Eddie Brock, like newly christened King in Black Eddie Brock, arrives in the garden and meets all of the other kings. He does not want to stay there. He time traveled into the future for a reason. He wants to find out what happens to him, and he also wants to save Dylan, who separately, in his own adventure, has gotten himself into danger back in the quote-unquote present. This gets Eddie into a conflict with Meridius, who is very clearly evil. I mean, look at him, he's a very sinister-looking guy. Meridius beats the ever-living shit out of Eddie so badly that his symbiote matter fundamentally changes, leading to the next incarnation. This is where Eddie becomes the King in Black known as Finnegan. The reason that Finnegan looks weak and shriveled is that he is weak and shriveled. This is Eddie when he is starting to understand the gravity of his situation. He has just been bested, and now he's not sure what to do, which is why he appears like this. Finnegan's timeline then loops back around, with his shock and panic at the situation turning into rage. This is helped along by a little bit of magic, which is a kind of tangential thing to the arc, but eventually, Finnegan's rage overtakes him, becoming his primary character trait, marking the transition from Finnegan into Bedlam. Bedlam is almost a mindless brute, motivated purely by anger, which is a very literal callback to Eddie's earlier days when he was motivated by his hatred for Spider-Man. Unfortunately for Bedlam, mindless rage is not nearly enough to break him out of this cycle of fate, and as his timeline loops back around, his rage calms to bitterness. This is when the next transition begins and Bedlam becomes Wild. Wild is clearly not as angry looking as Bedlam, but he is very sarcastic, jaded, and nihilistic. He has tried to fight his fate and it does not work, so now he's just along for the ride. Eventually, as will happen with all of them, Wild's timeline loops around again, and his bitterness cools even further into acceptance. Eventually, he is going to quote-unquote win, because all of these characters are on one singular timeline, and he will eventually become Meridius. This marks his transformation into Tyro. Tyro is a bootlicker, essentially. He is a servant of Meridius in every way possible, and is trying to learn from his future self. His only motivation is that he wants to be on the winning side. He sees Meridius as the winner, and so by sucking up to him, he will eventually turn into the winner, or at least that's his logic at the time. This is not going to work out because Meridius notably hates Tyro, and Tyro eventually realizes this, splitting off to go and seek power and evolution for himself, which of course gives him the strength and confidence to eventually become Meridius. Also, there is technically one more, a seventh noodle in our bowl of spaghetti, if you will, but I'm saving that one to the end because the flow of the video will work best that way, so you'll see when we get there. Now, I know that was a lot, so I will summarize it again one more time just to be very clear. It starts as Eddie. Eddie loses and becomes Finnegan. Finnegan becomes angry and turns into Bedlam. Bedlam becomes jaded and turns into Wild. Wild becomes desperate and turns into Tyro, and then Tyro gains confidence, turning into Meridius. All of these characters are one singular one. They exist along the exact same timeline. This is not alternate universe nonsense. They are just all time-traveling characters who all have the power of the Kings in Black and therefore can project themselves into symbiote bodies. At this point in their timeline, everything is intersecting so that they all arrive at the Garden of Time to experience the same moment from a bunch of different perspectives. Is the spaghetti metaphor starting to make a little bit more sense? This is why I also say the book is not really written to be summarized, because the whole point of this comic is that it's one where you do get to see the exact same scene, where everything plays out identically and you get to see the same characters with the same lines, but because you have more context from the different iterations, every scene feels different even though it is technically not. The most important thing of all this is that all of these things are destined to happen inevitably. As complicated and twisty as Eddie's timeline is, from his perspective at least, it is linear. The rest of the world is jumping around and moving, but he is going on one set track. That track will take him through all of these iterations into Meridius. Or at least, that's what should happen. The thing that's really locking Eddie into this one singular path is the fact that there are no outside actors on this timeline. It's not like a bunch of people screwing with the flow of events. If all of these people are one singular guy, he can't change his own future, because every time he tries to go back or forward, well, that's just what the future versions of him have done as well. He is stuck because the hive mind has trapped him there. There is really only one point from which Eddie can actually break this cycle, and it is a point where he is not the King in Black. If he is the King in Black, then all the others are the King in Black as well, and they can mess with his history, blah blah blah, it's very complicated. But Eddie is different. Eddie is a man, and I don't mean Eddie's consciousness, I mean Eddie's literal physical body. This is a very wild twist, so I don't blame you at all if what I'm about to say does not immediately make sense in your brain. But to break out of this little time loop that he is caught in the destiny of, Eddie controls his physical human body using the King in Black abilities. He essentially projects himself into himself at a different point in time, which is one of the places that the other Kings in Black can no longer reach because they are not Eddie anymore. Only Eddie can access Eddie. Meridius is barred from doing that. So by becoming himself in a very literal way, that means Eddie has split off from the destined timeline, and then he goes and steals a time machine and crashes it into Meridius's face. Confused? Yeah, that will happen in this arc. And I think the thing that will help it make a little bit more sense is if we go into the thematics and the metaphor that all of this is going for. The idea of this arc is exploring the idea that Eddie Brock has always been bound to something else, be it Venom, or in this case, his own destiny and his future. This represents Eddie fully being himself for the first time, taking power in the fact that he is his own and not relying on some other force to give him that power. See, to the surprise of no one, Meridius has been behind this entire thing. He's the one that gave Eddie the cryptic message which set him on this journey, and he has been pulling the strings that lead to every other King in Black getting to their appointed transition point. He is bootstrap paradoxing himself. And he's doing that with hive mind time travel. Using the King in Black abilities, he is jumping himself to different symbiotes and orchestrating events. But since Eddie is not a symbiote, by separating himself from the hive and becoming just himself, that's how Eddie wins. This is something that Meridius can no longer affect, because Meridius has kind of forsaken himself as Eddie. He has become only the King in Black, thus he has lost power over his former humanity. I hope I explained that well. I'm really not 100% sure, but if you're still watching at this point in the video, I guess I did a good enough job that I didn't lose you. Anyway, human Eddie, who still has symbiote powers, even though he's a human, which is very gross to look at, goes on a little adventure with Dr. Doom trying to get a time machine. He eventually does get a time machine, and then he slams that thing back into the Garden of Time and hits Meridius. This does something very weird, which is also why I used the spaghetti metaphor with the multiple noodles. By breaking out of the loop, he has made it so that his destined selves no longer have to follow along their appointed paths. Now, in a lot of time travel stories, this might mean that these people just, disintegrate and vanish since their timeline has gotten erased, but this comic decides to do something a little bit more interesting and leaves them in their current states, meaning that all of the Kings in Black no longer have to become the future versions of themselves, so they're all just independent characters. These characters then go on to a little mini event called Venom War, which weirdly is not nearly as impactful on the lore as you might think it is, so we can skim it very quickly. Venom War is fun, don't get me wrong, but it is largely just fight scenes. I mean, quite literally, a large portion of this comic takes place in an actual wrestling ring. A lot of things are introduced in the middle of Venom War and then wrapped up in the same series, meaning they don't really have a lot of implication on Venom's greater lore, and therefore it's not stuff that we have to cover. Like this, which is called Venom World, and it's an alternate timeline where Venom takes over the entire planet. This looks like it should matter. It doesn't. They introduce this and then prevent this future in the same comic. The main things that we need to cover here are that Dylan Brock regains a good chunk of his power as Codex. This is actually something that happened earlier in the series, but again, he was kind of doing that at a street level, so it wasn't something that I was covering. Here we really get to see it come to fruition. And yeah, in the current status quo, Dylan is Codex again and can use his symbiote control powers, but because of complicated stuff, he has a limitation that he has to be bonded to a symbiote to do this, which means that he cannot just do this at any time, he has to have a partner. Most of the alternate Kings in Black, that being Meridius, Bedlam, Tyro, and Wild, all get destroyed during this arc, as well as Carnage. Carnage was on his own little side quest to become a god over the past couple years, by the way. Weirdly, it is more in the magic sphere of Marvel than it is the symbiote one, which is why I didn't talk about this. He goes to Hell, and he also goes to Asgard. There's a lot of complicated stuff, but in Venom War, he gets defeated and loses his godhood. So yeah, none of that really mattered either long term. The only really major thing that matters as an effect of Venom War is where Venom is, like the Venom symbiote itself. It has not been bonded to Eddie during this time. Eddie's been doing King in Black things, and while he has a bunch of symbiotes, Venom has been with Dylan. But that will not be the case after this arc. Where Venom is currently, I'm actually not going to get into a lot of detail on in this video. That is happening in a series called All New Venom, and I'm ending my summary here, barring something very important, which is what I want the actual conclusion of this video to be, not because All New Venom is bad. In fact, I actually think it's much better than a lot of the internet controversy would have you believe. The reason that I'm not talking about it is simply that it is an ongoing comic. Since this video is intended to be a lore catch-up thing, I don't like talking about series that are currently in the running, as the lore can change very frequently. And we know that's happening in All New Venom. In a couple of months, they are bringing Knull back. We don't know exactly how that's going to happen. It could be an alternate universe thing, could be time travel, whatever. But since that series is changing so frequently, I would rather end my summary where the lore is solid, and that way I don't give you information that becomes incorrect almost immediately. So this is where my analysis of the present-day canon of symbiotes ends, but there is one more thing we have to talk about: the ending. The actual ending of the symbiote timeline, the end of Eddie Brock's timeline. Now that might sound a little bit weird. How do we know that? I mean, I just said that I didn't want to talk about an ongoing series because the lore was going to change. How on earth am I so definitively aware of where things will end for real? So, you remember that I said there was another character in the weird time travel arc? Yeah, time to talk about that one. This is the Eventuality. During his time travel adventures, Eddie comes into contact with this thing, a mysterious entity that usually just manifests as a single floating hand. This being is Eddie Brock's final form. This is him at the end of all of his storylines when he has accepted his role and become the true King in Black of reality. Remember way back in the beginning of the video where I told you the lore of the King in Black as a role and how it was an opposite to the Beyonders and all that stuff? Most of that is revealed in this comic. This is the truth of his role as revealed to Eddie by the Eventuality itself. See, while Knull was the first King in Black, he was never going to be the ultimate one. His role in the timeline was to be appointed and then perish, passing things along to Eddie. Then Eddie would unlock his ability to move the symbiote hive throughout time, and that gave him the ability to influence things at the scale that was necessary. All of the things that we've been following, all of the weird time travel nonsense and the other Kings in Black, those were means to an end, and the Eventuality is that end. How long it takes before this end is reached, we don't actually know, and the answer might be multiple things at once. This entity reveals to Eddie that it is something very cool and extremely rare for comic books, which is a true inevitability. No matter how many pathways Eddie takes, no matter whether he loses this power and then regains it again, and then becomes something else and gains the symbiote and loses the symbiote, whatever comic book retcons happen, the Eventuality will always come to pass, and that is a true, undeniable statement. This is its real power. The concept of the Eventuality plays off the idea that the story of Venom never ends. It is a meta-commentary on this character as a whole. Venom and Eddie will go on a million different stories and they will be a million different things, but they will always reach the Eventuality. And because the Eventuality is the end point, that means it has experienced all of these different things. All timelines converge there. It has experienced everything that the universe has to offer, and this makes it the King in Black. Remember, the power of the King in Black is to influence the universe from within. The Kings in White mess with it from the outside, and the King in Black is the internal force. To really be an internal force, it has to be everything. In a weird, esoteric way, this makes the Eventuality like a symbiote for existence. It is bonded to everything, ingrained within everything, and by projecting itself and its hive mind and everything that it is throughout anywhere it needs to go, this is how it protects the universe. The eventuality can show up anywhere because it has been everywhere, and everything will eventually reach the eventuality because the eventuality has been everything. It's a strange and complex concept to wrap your head around, but that is the idea. The thematic aspects of this, they're good. I'm sure this is going to seem very weird to people who don't know the exact lore of Venom up to this point, or I mean, at least didn't before this video. But when you really think about it, this is a strangely natural conclusion to everything that Venom means. The point of Venom, like the narrative point, has changed a lot over the decades of this character. Originally, he was meant to be a metaphor for drug addiction in some ways. Then, as we entered later decades, he became a metaphor for toxic relationships, and sometimes a very literal representation of toxic relationships. There are themes of obsession in Venom, themes of attachment, themes of codependence, but the one thing that always permeates every story of Venom and Eddie Brock is that it's never just about one thing. The tragedy of Eddie Brock and the tragedy of symbiotes as an entire concept is that they are almost never individuals. To be symbiotic, you have to work with something. The eventuality simply amplifies this idea to its final extreme, taking the themes that have always been present in Eddie and making them literal. Eddie Brock is bound to the entire universe. He is one of the anchor points, one of the core forces that has to keep the multiverse together. He doesn't necessarily want this job, and even he himself says that it's unfair that he has to take it. But he's Eddie Brock. He is going to be bound to symbiosis, and that means that while it is in many ways a prison, it is something that he has to do to survive and for everything else to survive. It is fascinating, and it's the exact kind of thing that I would expect Al Ewing, who wrote this, to do. If he's going to do one thing in a comic book, it is going to be tie the narrative into the cosmology of the world. Now, some of you might not like this, and I do kind of understand where you're coming from. This is a very different status quo for Venom, and it might not be what a lot of you signed on to the character for. But that's the other thing that makes the eventuality great. It is inevitable, and what leads to that point doesn't particularly matter for this to be true. Eddie has been many things and will be many more. He can be a hero, he can be an anti-hero, he can be a villain, but he will eventually end up at the same point. This is his role, this is his destiny, this is his symbiosis, and it is inevitable. What this comic does is acknowledge and sort of unify all the different things that symbiotes have been. Depending on what era of comics you're reading, they might be weird aliens, they might be shards of living darkness, they might be part of a hive mind, they might not be. Sometimes they're just going to be a thing that Spider-Man or even Deadpool wears. But all of these are true, and all of them can be true. Right now, in the current canon, there are so many symbiotes out there, and many of them only got singular offhand mentions in this video. Venom is bonded to Mary Jane Watson. Eddie is Carnage currently. That's another ongoing storyline that I might cover on here when the series finally wraps up. Knull is gone, but he's going to be coming back. Things are always going to be changing because that's the nature of comics. It can make my job rough for my personal take on it. Believe me, I had a lot of trouble deciding what to fit into this video given how much symbiote lore there is and how often it changes. And it's going to change again, too. In 5 years' time, all of this will be different, and I'll have to do an update video correcting everything for the new era. I wish I could be like the eventuality at the end of time looking back on everything with the definitive answers, but that's simply not how it works. For now, we're just on one of the pathways, one that begins with Knull and then goes to Telkar and Peter Parker and Eddie Brock and Flash Thompson and Eddie again and a million other people in between. This is what the symbiotes are now. We know that much, and we know what they will eventually be in the future. As for the midpoint, well, when those other paths reveal themselves, I will be more than happy to talk about them. Thank you all so much for watching. This was the hardest video I've ever had to record. Choosing what to include and what to cut from decades of symbiote history was a task and a half. However, if you want more, that actually is an opportunity with this one because I'm trying something new. For anyone who does not know, I have a Patreon. There are a couple perks you can get on there, mostly early and ad-free access to all of my long-form videos, but also an exclusive video every month. and for this month, that's going to be bonus features. There were so many weird and wild symbiotes that I wanted to bring up because they were worth talking about, but whose storylines were just too tangential or too nonsensical in relation to the main symbiote lore that I could not fit them in without going on a whole ramble. The Patreon exclusive video for July 2025 is going to be a bunch of those rapid fire. So if you're interested in hearing about a bunch of the weirdest symbiotes that Marvel has ever made, like Payback and Wreck Rap and Big Mother, that is available for you right now. It is not required viewing for this one. Like I said, it's kind of a bonus features thing, but that is available currently on my Patreon. Username exact same as here, link in bio, link on channel page, very easy to find. And huge shout out to the people who are already supporting me over there. It does a lot for helping me to keep making videos for you guys, so I appreciate you very much. Another big shout out to my artist, Ruben Perez, who drew the poses of the character that you've been watching talk at you for the last 2.5 hours. I always love working with him, so go check out his other stuff. And now, finally, after a truly ungodly amount of hours reading and researching and recording this video, my symbiote bond is broken, and I am finally free. Anyway, here's Venom Horse.